Chapter 15. The Hogwarts High Inquisitor. They'd expected to have to comb Hermione's Daily Prophet carefully next morning to find the article Percy had mentioned in his letter. However, the departing delivery owl had barely cleared the top of the milk jug when Hermione let out a huge gasp and flattened the newspaper to reveal a large photograph of Dolores Umbridge smiling widely and blinking slowly at them from beneath the headline, Ministry Seeks Educational Reform, Dolores Umbridge appointed first ever High Inquisitor. Umbridge? High Inquisitor, said Harry darkly, his half-eaten piece of toast slipping from his fingers. What does that mean? Hermione read aloud. In a surprise move last night, the Ministry of Magic passed new legislation giving itself an unprecedented level of control at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The Minister has been growing uneasy about goings-on at Hogwarts for some time, said Junior Assistant to the Minister, Percy Weasley. He is now responding to concerns voiced by anxious parents who feel the school may be moving in a direction they do not approve of. This is not the first time in recent weeks that the Minister, Cornelius Fudge, has used new laws to effect improvements at the Wizarding School. As recently as 30th of August, Educational Decree number 22 was passed to ensure that in the event of the current headmaster being unable to provide a candidate for a teaching post, the Ministry should select an appropriate person. That's how Dolores Umbridge came to be appointed to the teaching staff at Hogwarts, said Weasley last night. Dumbledore couldn't find anyone, so the Minister put in Umbridge, and of course she's been an immediate success. She's been a what? Said Harry loudly. Wait, there's more, said Hermione grimly. An immediate success, totally revolutionising the teaching of Defence Against the Dark Arts and providing the Minister with on-the-ground feedback about what's really happening at Hogwarts. It is the last function that the Ministry has now formalised with the passing of Educational Decree number 23, which creates the new position of Hogwarts High Inquisitor. This is an exciting new phase in the Minister's plan to get to grips with what some are calling the falling standards at Hogwarts, said Weasley. The Inquisitor will have powers to inspect her fellow educators and make sure that they are coming up to scratch. Professor Umbridge has been offered this position in addition to her own teaching post, and we are delighted to say that she has accepted. The Ministry's new moves have received enthusiastic support from parents of students at Hogwarts. I feel much easier in my mind now that I know Dumbledore is being subjected to fair and objective evaluation, said Mr. Lucius Malfoy. It's 41, speaking from his Wiltshire mansion last night. Many of us with our children's best interests at heart have been concerned about some of Dumbledore's eccentric decisions in the last few years, and are glad to know that the Ministry is keeping an eye on the situation. Among those eccentric decisions are undoubtedly the controversial staff appointments previously described in this newspaper, which have included the employment of werewolf Remus Lupin, half-giant Rubeus Hagrid, and delusional ex-Aura Mad-Eye Moody. Rumours abound, of course, that Albus Dumbledore, once Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards and Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, is no longer up to the task of managing the prestigious school of Hogwarts. I think the appointment of the Inquisitor is a first step towards ensuring that Hogwarts has a headmaster in whom we can all repose our confidence, said a Ministry insider last night. Wizengamot elders Griselda Marchbanks and Tiberius Ogden have resigned in protest at the introduction of the post of Inquisitor to Hogwarts. Hogwarts is a school, not an outpost of Cornelius Fudge's office, said Madame Marchbanks. This is a further disgusting attempt to discredit Albus Dumbledore. For a full account of Madame Marchbanks' alleged links to subversive goblin groups, turn to page 17. Hermione finished reading and looked across the table at the other two. So, now we know how we ended up with Umbridge. Fudge passed this educational decree and forced her on us, and now he's given her the power to inspect the other teachers. Hermione was breathing fast, and her eyes were very bright. I can't believe this. It's outrageous. I know it is, said Harry. He looked down at his right hand, clenched on the tabletop, and saw the faint white outline of the words Umbridge had forced him to cut into his skin. But a grin was unfurling on Ron's face. What? Said Harry and Hermione together, staring at him. Oh, I can't wait to see McGonagall inspected, said Ron happily. Umbridge won't know what's hit her. Well, come on, said Hermione, jumping up. We'd better get going. If she's inspecting Bin's class, we don't want to be late. But Professor Umbridge was not inspecting their History of Magic lesson, which was just as dull as the previous Monday, nor was she in Snape's dungeon when they arrived for double potions, where Harry's Moonstone essay was handed back to him with a large spiky black D scrawled in the upper corner. I have awarded you grades you would have received if you presented this work in your owl, said Snape with a smirk, as he swept among them, passing back their homework. This should give you a realistic idea of what to expect in the examination. Snape reached the front of the class and turned to face them. The general standard of this homework was abysmal. Most of you have failed. Had this been your examination, I expect to see a great deal more effort for this week's essay on the various varieties of venom antidotes, or I shall have to start handing out detentions to those dunces who get a D." He smirked as Malfoy sniggered and said in a carrying whisper, "Some people got a D." Harry realised that Hermione was looking sideways to see what grade he had received. He slid his Moonstone essay back into his bag as quickly as possible, feeling that he would rather keep that information private. Determined not to give Snape an excuse to fail him this lesson, Harry read and reread every line of instructions on the blackboard at least 3 times before acting on them. His strengthening solution was not precisely the clear turquoise shade of Hermione's, but it was at least blue rather than pink, like Neville's, and he delivered a flask of it to Snape's desk at the end of the lesson with a feeling of mingled defiance and relief. "Well, that wasn't as bad as last week, was it?" said Hermione, as they climbed the steps out of the dungeon and made their way across the entrance hall towards lunch. "And the homework didn't go too badly either, did it?" When neither Ron nor Harry answered, she pressed on. "I mean, all right, I didn't expect the top grade, not if it's he's marking to owl standard, but a pass is quite encouraging at this stage, wouldn't you say?" Harry made a non-committal noise in his throat. "Of course, a lot can happen between now and the exam. We've got plenty of time to improve, but the grades we're getting now are a sort of baseline, aren't they? Something we can build on." They sat down together at the Gryffindor table. "Obviously, I'd have been thrilled if I'd got an O." "Hermione," said Ron sharply, "if you want to know what grades we got, ask." I didn't mean, well, if you want to tell me." "I got a P," said Ron, ladling soup into his bowl. "Happy?" "Well, that's nothing to be ashamed of," said Fred, who had just arrived at the table with George and Lee Jordan and was sitting down on Harry's right. "Nothing wrong with a good healthy P." "But," said Hermione, "doesn't P stand for poor?" "Yeah," said Lee Jordan. "Still better than D, isn't it? Dreadful." Harry felt his face grow warm and faked a small coughing fit over his roll. When he emerged from this, he was sorry to find that Hermione was still in full flow about owl grades. "So, top grade's O for outstanding," she was saying, "and then there's A." "No, E," George corrected her. "E for exceeds expectations. And I've always thought Fred and I should have got E in everything, because we exceeded expectations just by turning up for the exams." They all laughed except Hermione, who ploughed on. "So after E, it's A for acceptable, and that's the last pass grade, isn't it?" "Yep," said Fred, dunking an entire roll in his soup, transferring it to his mouth and swallowing it whole. "Then you get P for poor," Ron raised both his arms in mock celebration, "and D for dreadful." "And then T," George reminded him. "T?" asked Hermione, looking appalled. "Even lower than a D? What on earth does T stand for?" "Troll," said George promptly. Harry laughed again, though he was not sure whether or not George was joking. He imagined trying to conceal from Hermione that he had received T's in all his owls and immediately resolved to work harder from now on. "You lot had an expected lesson yet?" Fred asked them. "No," said Hermione at once. "Have you?" "Just now, before lunch," said George. "Charms." "What was it like?" Harry and Hermione asked together. Fred shrugged. "Not that bad. Umbridge just lurked in the corner making notes on a clipboard. You know what Flitwick's like. He treated her like a guest, didn't seem to bother him at all. She didn't say much, asked Alicia a couple of questions about what the classes are normally like. Alicia told her they were really good. That was it." "I can't see old Flitwick getting marked down," said George. "He usually gets everything through their exams all right." "Who've you got this afternoon?" Fred asked Harry. "Trelawney." "A T if ever I saw one. And Umbridge herself." "Well, be a good boy and keep your temper with Umbridge today," said George. "Angelina will do her nut if you miss any more Quidditch practices." But Harry did not have to wait for Defence Against the Dark Arts to meet Professor Umbridge. He was pulling out his dream diary in a seat at the very back of the shadowy divination room when Ron elbowed him in the ribs, and looking around he saw Professor Umbridge emerging through the trapdoor in the floor. The class, which had been talking cheerily, fell silent at once. The abrupt fall in the noise level made Professor Trelawney, who had been wafting about handing out copies of the Dream Oracle, look around. "Good afternoon, Professor Trelawney," said Professor Umbridge with her wide smile. "You received my note, I trust, giving the time and date of your inspection?" Professor Trelawney nodded curtly and looked very disgruntled, turned her back on Professor Umbridge and continued to give out books. Still smiling, Professor Umbridge grasped the back of the nearest armchair and pulled it to the front of the class so that it was a few inches behind Professor Trelawney's seat. She then sat down, took her clipboard from her flowery bag and looked up expectantly, waiting for the class to begin. Professor Trelawney pulled her shawls tight about her with slightly trembling hands and surveyed the class through her hugely magnifying lenses. "We shall be continuing our study of prophetic dreams today," she said in a brave attempt at her usual mystic tones, though her voice shook slightly. Divide into pairs, please, and interpret each other's latest night-time visions with the aid of the oracle." She made as though to sweep back to her seat, saw Professor Umbridge sitting right beside it, and immediately veered left towards Parvati and Lavender, who were already deep in discussion about Parvati's most recent dream. Harry opened his copy of the Dream Oracle, watching Umbridge covertly. She was already making notes on her clipboard. After a few minutes, she got to her feet and began to pace the room in Trelawney's wake, listening to her conversations with students and posing questions here and there. Harry bent his head hurriedly over his book. "Think of a dream, quick," he told Ron, "in case the old toad comes our way." "I did it last time," Ron protested. "It's your turn. You tell me one." "Oh, I don't know," said Harry desperately, who could not remember dreaming anything at all over the last few days. "Let's say I dreamed I was drowning Snape in my cauldron. Yeah, that'll do." Ron chortled as he opened his dream oracle. "Okay, we've got to add your age to the date you had the dream, the number of letters in the subject. Would that be drowning or cauldron or Snape?" "It doesn't matter. Pick any of them," said Harry, chancing a glance behind him. Professor Umbridge was now standing at Professor Trelawney's shoulder making notes, while the divination teacher questioned Neville about his dream diary. "What night did you dream this again?" Ron said, immersed in calculations. "I don't know, last night. Whenever you like," Harry told him, trying to listen to what Umbridge was saying to Professor Trelawney. They were only a table away from him and Ron now. Professor Umbridge was making another note on her clipboard, and Professor Trelawney was looking extremely put out. "Now," said Umbridge, looking up at Trelawney, "you've been in this post how long exactly?" Professor Trelawney scowled at her, arms crossed and shoulders hunched, as though wishing to protect herself as much as possible from the indignity of the inspection. After a slight pause in which she seemed to decide that the question was not so offensive that she could reasonably ignore it, she said in a deeply resentful tone, "Nearly 16 years. "Quite a period," said Professor Umbridge, making note on her clipboard. "So it was Professor Dumbledore who appointed you?" "That's right," said Professor Trelawney shortly. Professor Umbridge made another note. "And you are a great-great-granddaughter of the celebrated seer Cassandra Trelawney?" "Yes," said Professor Trelawney, holding her head a little higher, another note on the clipboard. "But I think, correct me if I'm mistaken, that you are the first in your family since Cassandra to be possessed of second sight." "These things often skip, 3 generations," said Professor Trelawney. Professor Umbridge's toad-like smile widened. "Of course," she said sweetly, making yet another note. "Well, if you could just predict something for me then?" And she looked up inquiringly, still smiling. Professor Trelawney stiffened, as though unable to believe her ears. "I don't understand you," she said, clutching convulsively at the shawl around her scrawny neck. "I'd like you to make a prediction for me," said Professor Umbridge very clearly. Harry and Ron were not the only people now watching and listening sneakily from behind their books. Most of the class were staring, transfixed, at Professor Trelawney as she drew herself up to her full height, her beads and bangles clinking. "The inner eye does not see upon command," she said, in scandalized tones. "I see," said Professor Umbridge softly, making yet another note on her clipboard. But wait," said Professor Trelawney suddenly, in an attempt at her usual ethereal voice, though the mystical effect was ruined somewhat by the way it was shaking with anger. I think I do see something that concerns you. Why, I sense something dark, some grave peril." Professor Trelawney pointed a shaking finger at Professor Umbridge, who continued to smile blandly at her, eyebrows raised. I'm afraid you're in grave danger," Professor Trelawney finished dramatically. There was a pause. Professor Umbridge's eyebrows were still raised. "Right," she said softly, scribbling on her clipboard once more. "Well, if that's really the best you can do." She turned away, leaving Professor Trelawney standing rooted to the spot, her chest heaving. Harry caught Ron's eye and knew that Ron was thinking exactly the same as he was. They both knew that Professor Trelawney was an old fraud, but on the other hand they loathed Umbridge so much that they felt very much on Trelawney's side, until she swooped down on them a few seconds later, that is. "Well," she said, snapping her long fingers under Harry's nose, uncharacteristically brisk, "let's see the start you've made on your dream diary, please." And by the time she had interpreted Harry's dreams at the top of her voice, all of which, even the ones that involved eating porridge, apparently foretold a gruesome and early death, he was feeling much less sympathetic towards her. All the while Professor Umbridge stood a few feet away, making notes on that clipboard, and when the bell rang she descended the silver ladder first, and was waiting for them all when they reached their Defence Against the Dark Arts lesson 10 minutes later. She was humming and smiling to herself when they entered the room. Harry and Ron told Hermione, who had been in arithmancy, exactly what had happened in divination, while they all took out their copies of Defensive Magical Theory. But before Hermione could ask any questions, Professor Umbridge had called them all to order and silence fell. "One's away, she instructed them all with a smile, and those people who had been hopeful enough to take them out sadly returned them to their bags. As we finished Chapter 1 last lesson, I would like you all to turn to page 19 today and commence Chapter 2, Common Defensive Theories and Their Derivation. There will be no need to talk. Still smiling her wide, self-satisfied smile, she sat down at her desk. The class gave an audible sigh as it turned as one to page 19. Harry wondered dully whether there were enough chapters in the book to keep them reading through all this year's lessons, and was on the point of checking the contents page when he noticed that Hermione had her hand in the air again. Professor Umbridge had noticed too, and what was more, she seemed to have worked out a strategy for just such an eventuality. Instead of trying to pretend she had not noticed Hermione, she got to her feet and walked around the front row of desks until they were face to face. Then she bent down and whispered, so that the rest of the class could not hear. "What is it this time, Miss Granger?" I've already read Chapter 2, said Hermione. "Well then, proceed to Chapter 3. "I've read that too. I've read the whole book." Professor Umbridge blinked, but recovered her poise almost instantly. "Well then, you should be able to tell me what Slinkhard says about counterjinxes in Chapter 15. "He says the counterjinxes are improperly named," said Hermione promptly. "He says counterjinx is just a name people give their jinxes when they want to make them sound more acceptable." Professor Umbridge raised her eyebrows, and Harry knew she was impressed, against her will. "But I disagree," Hermione continued. Professor Umbridge's eyebrows rose a little higher, and her gaze became distinctly colder. "You disagree?" "Yes, I do," said Hermione, who, unlike Umbridge, was not whispering, but speaking in a clear, carrying voice that by now attracted the attention of the rest of the class. "Mr. Slinkhard doesn't like jinxes, does he? But I think they can be very useful when they're used defensively." "Oh, you do you?" said Professor Umbridge, forgetting to whisper and straightening up. "Well, I'm afraid it is Mr. Slinkhard's opinion and not yours that matters within this classroom, Miss Granger." "But," Hermione began. "That is enough," said Professor Umbridge. She walked back to the front of the class and stood before them, all the jauntiness she had shown at the beginning of the lesson gone. "Miss Granger, I'm going to take 5 points from Gryffindor House." There was an outbreak of muttering at this. "What for?" said Harry angrily. "Don't you get involved," Hermione whispered urgently to him. "For disrupting my class with pointless interruptions," said Professor Umbridge smoothly. "I'm here to teach you using a ministry-approved method that does not include inviting students to give their opinions on matters about which they understand very little. Your previous teachers in the subject may have allowed you more license, but as none of them, with the possible exception of Professor Quirrell, who did at least appear to have restricted himself to age-appropriate subjects, would have passed a ministry inspection." "Yeah, Quirrell was a great teacher," said Harry loudly. "There was just that minor drawback of him having Lord Voldemort sticking out the back of his head." This pronouncement was followed by one of the loudest silences Harry had ever heard. Then, "I think another week's detentions would do you some good, Mr. Potter," said Umbridge sleekly. The cut on the back of Harry's hand had barely healed, and by the following morning it was bleeding again. He did not complain during the evening's detention. He was determined not to give Umbridge the satisfaction. Over and over again he wrote, "I must not tell lies," and not a sound escaped his lips, though the cut deepened with every letter. The very worst part of the second week's worth of detentions was, just as George had predicted, Angelina's reaction. She cornered him just as he arrived at the Gryffindor table for breakfast on Tuesday, and shouted so loudly that Professor McGonagall came sweeping down upon the pair of them from the staff table. "Miss Johnson, how dare you take such a racket in the Great Hall? 5 points from Gryffindor." "But, Professor, he's gone and landed himself in detention again." "What's this, Potter?" said Professor McGonagall sharply, rounding on Harry. "Detention? From whom?" "From Professor Umbridge," muttered Harry, not meeting Professor McGonagall's beady, square-framed eyes. "Are you telling me," she said, lowering her voice, so that the group of curious Ravenclaws behind them could not hear, "that after the warning I gave you last Monday, you lost your temper in Professor Umbridge's class again?" "Yes," Harry muttered, speaking to the floor. "Potter, you must get a grip on yourself. You are heading for serious trouble. Another 5 points from Gryffindor." "But what, Professor? No!" Harry said, furious at this injustice. "I'm already being punished by her. Why do you have to take points as well?" "Because detentions do not appear to have any effect on you whatsoever," said Professor McGonagall tartly. Not another word of complaint, Potter. And as for you, Miss Johnson, you will confine your shouting matches to the Quidditch pitch in future, or risk losing the team captaincy." Professor McGonagall strode back towards the staff table. Angelina gave Harry a look of deepest disgust and stalked away, upon which he flung himself onto the bench beside Ron, fuming. "She's taking points off Gryffindor because I'm having my hand sliced open every night. How is that fair? How? I know, mate, said Ron sympathetically, tipping bacon onto Harry's plate. She's bang out of order. Hermione, however, merely rustled the pages of her Daily Prophet and said nothing. You think McGonagall was right, do you? Said Harry angrily to the picture of Cornelius Fudge obscuring Hermione's face. I wish she hadn't taken points from you, but I think she's right to warn you not to lose your temper with Umbridge, said Hermione's voice, while Fudge gesticulated forcefully from the front page, clearly giving some kind of speech. Harry did not speak to Hermione all through Charms, but when they entered Transfiguration, he forgot about being cross with her. Professor Umbridge and her clipboard were sitting in a corner, and the sight of her drove the memory of breakfast right out of his head. Excellent, whispered Ron, as they sat down in their usual seats. Let's see Umbridge get what she deserves. Professor McGonagall marched into the room without giving the slightest indication that she knew Professor Umbridge was there. That will do, she said, and silence fell immediately. Mr. Finnegan, kindly come here and hand back the homework. Miss Brown, please take this box of mice. Don't be silly, girl. They won't hurt you. And hand one to each student. Hem, bem, said Professor Umbridge, employing the same silly little cough she had used to interrupt Dumbledore on the first night of term. Professor McGonagall ignored her. Seamus handed back Harry's essay. Harry took it out without looking at him and saw, to his relief, that he had managed an A. Right then, everyone, listen closely. Dean Thomas, if you do that to the mouse again, I shall put you in detention. Most of you have now successfully vanished your snails, and even those who were left with a certain amount of shell have got the gist of the spell. Today we shall be... said Professor Umbridge. Yes, said Professor McGonagall, turning around, her eyebrows so close together they seemed to form one long severe line. I was just wondering, Professor, whether you received my note telling you of the date and time of your inspection. Obviously I received it, or I would have asked you what you were doing in my classroom, said Professor McGonagall, turning her back firmly on Professor Umbridge. Many of the students exchanged looks of glee. As I was saying, today we shall be practising the altogether more difficult vanishment of mice. Now, the vanishing spell. I wonder, said Professor McGonagall in cold fury, turning on Professor Umbridge, how you expect to gain an idea of my usual teaching methods if you continue to interrupt me. You see, I do not generally permit people to talk while I am talking. Professor Umbridge looked as though she had just been slapped in the face. She did not speak, but straightened the parchment on her clipboard and began scribbling furiously. Looking supremely unconcerned, Professor McGonagall addressed the class once more. As I was saying, the vanishing spell becomes more difficult with the complexity of the animal to be vanished. The snail is an invertebrate, does not present much of a challenge. The mouse, as a mammal, offers a much greater one. This is not, therefore, magic you can accomplish with your mind on your dinner. So, you know the incantation. Let me see what you can do. How can she lecture me about not losing my temper with Umbridge? Harry muttered to Ron under his breath. But he was grinning. His anger with Professor McGonagall had quite evaporated. Professor Umbridge did not follow Professor McGonagall around the class as she had followed Professor Trelawney. Perhaps she realised Professor McGonagall would not permit it. She did, however, take many more notes while sitting in her corner. And when Professor McGonagall finally told them all to pack away, she rose with a grim expression on her face. Well, it's a start, said Ron, holding up a long, wriggling mouse tail and dropping it back into the box Lavender was passing around. As they filed out of the classroom, Harry saw Professor Umbridge approach the teacher's desk. He nudged Ron, who nudged Hermione in turn, and the three of them deliberately fell back to eavesdrop. How long have you been teaching at Hogwarts? Professor Umbridge asked. 39 years this December, said Professor McGonagall brusquely, snapping her bag shut. Professor Umbridge made a note. Very well, she said. You will receive the results of your inspection in 10 days' time. I can hardly wait, said Professor McGonagall in a coldly indifferent voice, and she strode off towards the door. Hurry up, you three, she added, sweeping Harry, Ron and Hermione before her. Harry could not help giving her a faint smile and could have sworn he received one in return. He had thought that the next time he would see Umbridge would be his detention that evening, but he was wrong. When they walked down the lawns towards the forest for care of magical creatures, they found her and her clipboard waiting for them beside Professor Grumbly Plank. You do not usually take this class, is that correct? Harry heard her ask as they arrived at the trestle table, where the group of captive bowtruckles were scrabbling around for woodlice like so many living twigs. Quite correct, said Professor Grumbly Plank, hands behind her back and bouncing on the balls of her feet. I am a substitute teacher, standing in for Professor Hagrid. Harry exchanged uneasy looks with Ron and Hermione. Malfoy was whispering with Crabbe and Goyle. He would surely love this opportunity to tell tales on Hagrid to a member of the Ministry. Said Professor Umbridge, dropping her voice. though Harry could still hear her quite clearly. "I wonder. The headmaster seems strangely reluctant to give me any information on the matter. Can you tell me what is causing Professor Hagrid's very extended leave of absence?" Harry saw Malfoy look up eagerly. "Afraid I can't," said Professor Grubbly Plank breezily. "Don't know anything more about it than you do. Got an owl from Dumbledore. Would I like a couple of weeks' teaching work? I accepted. That's as much as I know. Well, shall I get started then?" "Yes, please do," said Professor Umbridge, scribbling on her clipboard. Umbridge took a different tack in this class and wandered amongst the students, questioning them on magical creatures. Most people were able to answer well, and Harry's spirits lifted somewhat. At least the class was not letting Hagrid down. "Overall," said Professor Umbridge, returning to Professor Grubbly Plank's side, after a lengthy interrogation of Dean Thomas, "how do you, as a temporary member of staff, an objective outsider, I suppose you might say, how do you find Hogwarts? Do you feel you receive enough support from the school management?" "Oh, yes, Dumbledore's excellent," said Professor Grubbly Plank heartily. "Yes, I'm very happy with the way things are run. Very happy indeed." Looking politely incredulous, Umbridge made a tiny note on her clipboard and went on. "And what are you planning to cover with this class this year, assuming, of course, that Professor Hagrid does not return?" "Oh, I'll take them through the creatures that most often come up in owls," said Professor Grubbly Plank. "Not much left to do. They've studied unicorns and nifflers. I thought we'd cover porlocks and measles. Make sure they can recognise krups and gnarls, you know." "Well, you seem to know what you're doing at any rate," said Professor Umbridge, making a very obvious tick on her clipboard. Harry did not like the emphasis she put on "you," and liked it even less when she put her next question to Goyle. "Now, I hear there have been injuries in this class." Goyle gave a stupid grin. Malfoy hastened to answer the question. "That was me," he said. "I was slashed by a hippogriff." "A hippogriff?" said Professor Umbridge, now scribbling frantically. "Only because he was too stupid to listen to what Hagrid told him to do," said Harry angrily. Both Ron and Hermione groaned. Professor Umbridge turned her head slowly in Harry's direction. "Another night's detention, I think," she said softly. "Well, thank you very much, Professor Grubbly Plank. I think that's all I need here. You will be receiving the results of your inspection within 10 days. "Jolly good," said Professor Grubbly Plank, and Professor Umbridge set off back across the lawn to the castle. It was nearly midnight when Harry left Umbridge's office that night, his hand now bleeding so severely that it was staining the scarf he had wrapped around it. He expected the common room to be empty when he returned, but Ron and Hermione had sat up waiting for him. He was pleased to see them, especially as Hermione was disposed to be sympathetic rather than critical. "Here," she said anxiously, pushing a small bowl of yellow liquid towards him. "Soak your hand in that. It's a solution of strained and pickled murtlap tentacles. It should help." Harry placed his bleeding, aching hand into the bowl and experienced a wonderful feeling of relief. Crookshanks curled around his legs, purring loudly, then leapt into his lap and settled down. "Thanks," he said gratefully, scratching behind Crookshanks' ears with his left hand. "I still reckon you should complain about this," said Ron in a low voice. "No," said Harry flatly. "McGonagall would go nuts if she knew." "Yeah, she probably would," said Harry. "And how long do you reckon it would take Umbridge to pass another decree saying anyone who complains about the High Inquisitor gets sacked immediately?" Ron opened his mouth to retort, but nothing came out, and after a moment he closed it again, defeated. "She's an awful woman," said Hermione in a small voice. "Awful. You know, I was just saying to Ron when you came in, we've got to do something about her." "I suggested poison," said Ron grimly. "No, I mean something about what a dreadful teacher she is, and how we're not going to learn any defence from her at all," said Hermione. "Well, what can we do about that?" said Ron, yawning. "It's too late, isn't it? She's got the job. She's here to stay. Fudge will make sure of that." "Well," said Hermione tentatively, "you know, I was thinking today." She shot a slightly nervous look at Harry, and then plunged on. "I was thinking that maybe the time has come when we should just do it ourselves." "Do what ourselves?" said Harry suspiciously, still floating his hand in the essence of murtlap tentacles. "Well, learn defence against the dark arts ourselves," said Hermione. "Come off it," groaned Ron. "You want us to do extra work? Do you realise Harry and I are behind on homework again, and it's only the second week?" "But this is much more important than homework," said Hermione. Harry and Ron goggled at her. "I didn't think there was anything in the universe more important than homework," said Ron. "Don't be silly, of course there is," said Hermione, and Harry saw, with an ominous feeling, that her face was suddenly alight with the kind of fervour that spew usually inspired in her. "It's about preparing ourselves, like Harry said in Umbridge's first lesson, for what's waiting for us out there. It's about making sure we really can defend ourselves. If we don't learn anything for a whole year..." "We can't do much by ourselves," said Ron in a defeated voice. "I mean, all right, we can go and look jinxes up in the library and try and practice them, I suppose." "No, I agree. We've gone past the stage where we can just learn things out of books," said Hermione. "We need a teacher, a proper one, who can show us how to use the spells and correct us if we're going wrong." If you're talking about Lupin, Harry began. No, I'm not talking about Lupin, said Hermione. He's too busy with the Order, and anyway, the most we could see him is during Hogsmeade weekends, and that's not nearly often enough. Who then? Said Harry, frowning at her. Hermione heaved a very deep sigh. Isn't it obvious? She said. I'm talking about you, Harry. There was a moment's silence. A light night breeze rattled the window panes behind Ron, and the fire guttered. About me what? Said Harry. I'm talking about you teaching us defence against the dark arts. Harry stared at her. Then he turned to Ron, ready to exchange the exasperated looks they sometimes shared when Hermione elaborated on far-fetched schemes like spew. To Harry's consternation, however, Ron did not look exasperated. He was frowning slightly, apparently thinking, and then he said, That's an idea. What's an idea? Said Harry. You, said Ron, teaching us to do it. But Harry was grinning now. Sure, the pair of them were pulling his leg, but I'm not a teacher. I can't. Harry, you're the best in the year at defence against the dark arts, said Hermione. Me, said Harry, now grinning more broadly than ever. No, I'm not. You've beaten me in every test. Actually, I haven't, said Hermione coolly. You beat me in our third year, the only year we both sat the test and had a teacher who actually knew the subject. But I'm not talking about test results, Harry. Think what you've done. How do you mean? You know what? I'm not sure I want someone this stupid teaching me, Ron, said Hermione, smirking slightly. He turned to Harry. Let's think, he said, pulling a face like Goyle, concentrating. First year, you saved the Philosopher's Stone from you-know-who. But that was luck, said Harry. It wasn't skill. Second year, Ron interrupted, you killed the basilisk and destroyed Riddle. Yeah, but if Fawkes hadn't turned up, Third year, said Ron, louder still, you fought off about 100 Dementors at once. You know that was a fluke. If the Time Turner hadn't... Last year, Ron said, almost shouting now, you fought off you-know-who again. Listen to me, said Harry, almost angrily, because Ron and Hermione were both smirking now. Just listen to me, all right? It sounds great when you say it all like that, but all that stuff was luck. I didn't know what I was doing half the time. I didn't plan any of it. I just did whatever I could think of, and I nearly always had help. Ron and Hermione were still smirking, and Harry felt his temper rise. He wasn't even sure why he was feeling so angry. Don't sit there grinning like you know better than I do. I was there, wasn't I? He said heatedly. I know what went on, all right? And I didn't get through any of that because I was brilliant at defence against the dark arts. I got through it because help came at the right time, or because I guessed right. But I just blundered through it all. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Stop laughing! The bowl of murtlap essence fell to the floor and smashed. He became aware that he was on his feet, though he couldn't remember standing up. Crookshanks streaked away under a sofa. Ron and Hermione's smiles had vanished. You don't know what it's like, you. Neither of you. You've never had to face him, have you? You think it's just memorising a bunch of spells and throwing them at him, like you're in a class or something. The whole time you know there's nothing between you and dying except your own brain or guts or whatever. Like you can think straight when you know you're about a nanosecond from being murdered or tortured or watching your friends die. They've never taught us that in their classes. And it's what it's like to deal with things like that. And you two sit there acting like I'm a clever little boy to be standing here alive, like Diggory was stupid, like he messed up. You just don't get it. That could just as easily have been me. It would have been if Voldemort hadn't needed me. We weren't saying anything like that, mate, said Ron, looking aghast. We weren't having a go at Diggory, we didn't. You've got the wrong end of the... He looked helplessly at Hermione, whose face was stricken. Harry, she said timidly, don't you see? This is exactly why we need you. We need to know what it's really like. Facing him. Facing for Voldemort. It was the first time she had ever said Voldemort's name, and it was this, more than anything else, that calmed Harry. Still breathing hard, he sank back into his chair, becoming aware as he did so that his hand was throbbing horribly again. He wished he had not smashed the bowl of murtlap essence. Well, think about it, said Hermione quietly. Please? Harry could not think of anything to say. He was feeling ashamed of his outburst already. He nodded, hardly aware of what he was agreeing to. Hermione stood up. Well, I'm off to bed, she said, in a voice that was clearly as natural as she could make it. Night. Ron had to get to his feet too. Coming, he said awkwardly to Harry. Yeah, said Harry. In a minute. I'll just clear this up. He indicated the smashed bowl on the floor. Ron nodded and left. Reparo, Harry muttered, pointing his wand at the broken pieces of china. They flew back together, good as new. There was no returning the murtlap essence to the bowl. He was suddenly so tired he was tempted to sink back into his armchair and sleep there, but instead he forced himself to his feet and followed Ron upstairs. His restless night was punctuated once more by dreams of long corridors and locked doors, and he awoke next day with his scar prickling again. Chapter 16. In the Hog's Head. Hermione made no mention of Harry giving Defence Against the Dark Arts lessons for 2 whole weeks after her original suggestion. Harry's detentions with Umbridge were finally over. He doubted whether the words now etched into the back of his hand would ever fade entirely. Ron had had 4 more Quidditch practices and not been shouted at during the last 2, and all 3 of them had managed to vanish their mice in Transfiguration. Hermione had actually progressed to vanishing kittens before the subject was broached again on a wild, blustery evening at the end of September, when the 3 of them were sitting in the library, looking at potion ingredients for Snape. "I was wondering," Hermione said suddenly, "whether you'd thought any more about Defence Against the Dark Arts, Harry." "Course I have," said Harry grumpily. "Can't forget it, can we, with the hag teaching us? I meant the idea Ron and I had." Ron cast her an alarmed, threatening kind of look. She frowned at him. "Oh, all right, the idea I had then. About you teaching us." Harry did not answer at once. He pretended to be perusing a page of Asiatic anti-venoms because he did not want to say what was on his mind. He had given the matter a great deal of thought over the past fortnight. Sometimes it seemed an insane idea, just as it had on the night Hermione had proposed it. But on others, he had found himself thinking about the spells that had served him best in his various encounters with dark creatures and Death Eaters, found himself, in fact, subconsciously planning lessons. "Well," he said slowly, when he could no longer pretend to find Asiatic anti-venoms interesting. "Yeah, I thought about it a bit." "And?" said Hermione eagerly. "I dunno," said Harry, playing for time. He looked up at Ron. "I thought it was a good idea from the start," said Ron, who seemed keener to join in this conversation now that he was sure Harry was not going to start shouting again. Harry shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You did listen to what I said about a load of it being luck, didn't you?" "Yes, Harry," said Hermione gently, "but all the same, there's no point pretending that you're not good at Defence Against the Dark Arts, because you are. You were the only person last year who could throw off the Imperius Curse completely. You can produce a Patronus. You can do all sorts of stuff that full-grown wizards can't. Victor always said—" Ron looked around at her so fast he appeared to crick his neck. Rubbing it, he said, "Yeah, what did Vicky say?" "Ho ho," said Hermione in a bored voice. He and Harry knew how to do stuff even he didn't, and he was in the final year at Durmstrang. Ron was looking at Hermione suspiciously. "You're not still in contact with him, are you?" "So what if I am?" said Hermione coolly, though her face was a little pink. "I can have a pen pal if I—" "He didn't only want to be your pen pal," said Ron accusingly. Hermione shook her head exasperatedly, and ignoring Ron, who was continuing to watch her, said to Harry, "Well, what do you think? Will you teach us?" "Just you and Ron, yeah?" "Well," said Hermione, looking a mite anxious again. "Well, now don't fly off the handle again, Harry, please, but I really think you ought to teach anyone who wants to learn. I mean, we're talking about defending ourselves against Voldemort. Oh, don't be pathetic, Ron. It doesn't seem fair if we don't offer the chance to other people." Harry considered this for a moment and then said, "Yeah, but I doubt anyone except you two would want to be taught by me. I'm a nutter, remember? Well, I think you might be surprised how many people would be interested in hearing what you've got to say," said Hermione seriously. "Look." She leaned towards him. Ron, who was still watching her with a frown on his face, leaned forwards to listen too. "You know the first weekend in October is a Hogsmeade weekend. How would it be if we tell anyone who's interested to meet us in the village, and we can talk it over?" "Why do we have to do it outside school?" said Ron. "Because," said Hermione, returning to the diagram of the Chinese chomping cabbage she was copying, "I don't think Umbridge would be very happy if she found out what we were up to." Harry had been looking forward to the weekend trip into Hogsmeade, but there was one thing worrying him. Sirius had maintained a stony silence since he had appeared in the fire at the beginning of September. Harry knew they had made him angry by saying they didn't want him to come, but he still worried from time to time that Sirius might throw caution to the winds and turn up anyway. What were they going to do if the great black dog came bounding up the street towards them in Hogsmeade, perhaps under the nose of Draco Malfoy? "Well, you can't blame him for wanting to get out and about," said Ron, when Harry discussed his fears with him and Hermione. "I mean, he's been on the run for over 2 years, hasn't he? And I know that can't have been a laugh, but at least he was free, wasn't he? And now he's just shut up all the time with that ghastly elf." Hermione scowled at Ron, but otherwise ignored the slight on creature. "The trouble is," she said to Harry, "until Voldemort, oh, for heaven's sake, Ron comes out into the open, Sirius is going to have to stay hidden, isn't he? I mean, the stupid ministry isn't going to realise Sirius is innocent until they accept that Dumbledore's been telling the truth about him all along. And once the fools start catching real Death Eaters again, it'll be obvious Sirius isn't one. I mean, he hasn't got the mark, for one thing." "I don't reckon he'd be stupid enough to turn up," said Ron bracingly. "Dumbledore would go mad if he did, and Sirius listens to Dumbledore even if he doesn't like what he hears." When Harry continued to look worried, Hermione said, "Listen, Ron and I have been sounding out people who we thought might want to learn some proper defence against the dark arts, and there are a couple who seem interested. We've told them to meet us in Hogsmeade." "Right," said Harry vaguely, his mind still on Sirius. "Don't worry, Harry," Hermione said quietly. "You've got enough on your plate without Sirius too." She was quite right, of course. He was barely keeping up with his homework, though he was doing much better now that he was no longer spending every evening in detention with Umbridge. Ron was even further behind with his work than Harry, because while they both had Quidditch practice twice a week, Ron also had his prefect duties. However, Hermione, who was taking more subjects than either of them, had not only finished all her homework, but was also finding time to knit more elf clothes. Harry had to admit that she was getting better. It was now almost always possible to distinguish between the hats and the socks. The morning of the Hogsmeade visit dawned bright but windy. After breakfast they queued up in front of Filch, who matched their names to the long list of students who had permission from their parents or guardian to visit the village. With a slight pang, Harry remembered that if it hadn't been for Sirius, he would not have been going at all. When Harry reached Filch, the caretaker gave a great sniff as though trying to detect a whiff of something from Harry. Then he gave a curt nod that set his jowls a-quiver again, and Harry walked on, out onto the stone steps in the cold, sunlit day. Why was Filch sniffing you?" asked Ron, as he, Harry and Hermione set off at a brisk pace down the wide drive to the gates. "I suppose he was checking for the smell of dung bombs," said Harry, with a small laugh. "I forgot to tell you." And he recounted the story of sending his letter to Sirius, and Filch bursting in seconds later, demanding to see the letter. To his slight surprise, Hermione found this story highly interesting, much more, indeed, than he did himself. "He said he was tipped off you were ordering dung bombs, but who tipped him off?" "I don't know," said Harry, shrugging. "Maybe Malfoy. He'd think it was a laugh." They walked between the tall stone pillars topped with winged boars, and turned left onto the road into the village, the wind whipping their hair into their eyes. "Malfoy," said Hermione sceptically. "Well, yes, maybe." And she remained deep in thought all the way into the outskirts of Hogsmeade. "Where are we going anyway?" Harry asked. "The Free Broomsticks?" "Oh, no," said Hermione, coming out of her reverie. "No, it's always packed and really noisy. I've told the others to meet us in the Hog's Head, that other pub. You know the one. It's not on the main road. I think it's a bit, dodgy, but students don't normally go in there, so I don't think we'll be overheard." They walked down the main street, past Zonko's Wizarding Joke Shop, where they were not surprised to see Fred, George and Lee Jordan, past the post office from which owls issued at regular intervals, and turned up a side street, at the top of which stood a small inn. A battered wooden sign hung from a rusty bracket over the door, with a picture on it of a wild boar's severed head, leaking blood onto the white cloth around it. The sign creaked in the wind as they approached. All three of them hesitated outside the door. "Well, come on," said Hermione, slightly nervously. Harry led the way inside. It was not at all like the Free Broomsticks, whose large bar gave an impression of gleaming warmth and cleanliness. The Hog's Head bar comprised one small, dingy and very dirty room that smelled strongly of something that might have been goats. The bay windows were so encrusted with grime that very little daylight could penetrate the room, which was lit instead with the stubs of candles sitting on rough wooden tables. The floor seemed at first glance to be compressed earth, though as Harry stepped onto it, he realised that there was stone beneath what seemed to be the accumulated filth of centuries. Harry remembered Hagrid mentioning the pub in his first year. "Yeah, got a lot of funny folk in a Hog's Head," he had said, explaining how he had won a dragon's egg from a hooded stranger there. At the time, Harry had wondered why Hagrid had not found it odd that the stranger kept his face hidden throughout their encounter. Now he saw that keeping your face hidden was something of a fashion in the Hog's Head. There was a man at the bar whose whole head was wrapped in dirty grey bandages, though he was still managing to gulp endless glasses of some smoking, fiery substance through a slit over his eyes, through his mouth. Two figures, shrouded in hoods, sat at a table in one of the windows. Harry might have thought them Dementors if they had not been talking in strong Yorkshire accents. In a shadowy corner, beside the fireplace, sat a witch with a thick black veil that fell to her toes. They could just see the tip of her nose because it caused the veil to protrude slightly. "I don't know about this, Hermione," Harry muttered as they crossed to the bar. He was looking particularly at the heavily veiled witch. "Has it occurred to you Umbridge might be under that?" Hermione cast an appraising eye over the veiled figure. "Umbridge is shorter than that woman," she said quietly. "And anyway, even if Umbridge does come in here, there's nothing she can do to stop us, Harry, because I've double and triple checked the school rules. We're not out of bounds. I specifically asked Professor Flitwick whether students were allowed to come into the Hog's Head, and he said yes, but he advised me strongly to bring our own glasses. And I've looked up everything I can think of about study groups and homework groups. and they're definitely allowed. I just don't think it's a good idea if we parade what we're doing." "No," said Harry dryly, "especially as it's not exactly a homework group you're planning, is it?" The barman sidled towards them out of a back room. He was a grumpy-looking old man with a great deal of long grey hair and beard. He was tall and thin and looked vaguely familiar to Harry. "What?" he grunted. "3 butterbeers, please," said Hermione. The man reached beneath the counter and pulled up 3 very dusty, very dirty bottles, which he slammed onto the bar. "6 sickles," he said. "I'll get them," said Harry quickly, passing over the silver. The barman's eyes travelled over Harry, resting for a fraction of a second on his scar. Then he turned away and deposited Harry's money in an ancient wooden till, whose drawer slid open automatically to receive it. Harry, Ron and Hermione retreated to the furthest table from the bar and sat down looking around. The man in the dirty grey bandages rapped the counter with his knuckles and received another smoking drink from the barman. "You know what?" Ron murmured, looking over at the bar with enthusiasm. "We could order anything we like in here. I bet that bloke would sell us anything. He wouldn't care. I've always wanted to try fire whiskey." "You are a prefect," snarled Hermione. "Oh," said Ron, the smile fading from his face. "Yeah. So, who did you say is supposed to be meeting us?" Harry asked, wrenching open the rusty top of his butterbeer and taking a swig. "Just a couple of people," Hermione repeated, checking her watch and looking anxiously towards the door. "I told them to be here about now, and I'm sure they all know where it is. Oh, look, this might be them now." The door of the pub had opened. A thick band of dusty sunlight split the room in two for a moment, and then vanished, blocked by the incoming rush of a crowd of people. First came Neville, with Dean and Lavender, who were closely followed by Parvati and Padma Patil. With, Harry's stomach did a backflip, Cho and one of her usually giggling girlfriends. Then, on her own and looking so dreamy she might have walked in by accident, Luna Lovegood. Then Katie Bell, Alicia Spinnet and Angelina Johnson, Colin and Dennis Creevy, Ernie Macmillan, Justin Finch Fletchley, Hannah Rabbit, a Hufflepuff girl with a long plait down her back, whose name Harry did not know. 3 Ravenclaw boys he was pretty sure were called Anthony Goldstein, Michael Corner and Terry Boot, and then Ginny, followed by a tall skinny blonde boy with an upturned nose whom Harry recognised vaguely as being a member of the Hufflepuff Quidditch team, and bringing up the rear, Fred and George Weasley, with their friend Lee Jordan, all 3 of whom were carrying large paper bags crammed with Zonko's merchandise. "A couple of people," said Harry hoarsely to Hermione. "A couple of people?" "Yes, well, the idea seemed quite popular," said Hermione happily. "Ron, do you want to pull up some more chairs?" The barman had frozen in the act of wiping out a glass with a rag so filthy it looked as though it had never been washed. Possibly he had never seen his pub so full. "Hi," said Fred, reaching the bar first and counting his companions quickly. "Could we have 25 butterbeers, please?" The barman glared at him for a moment, then, throwing down his rag irritably as though he had been interrupted in something very important, he started passing up dusty butterbeers from under the bar. "Cheers," said Fred, handing them out. "Cough up, everyone. I haven't got enough gold for all of these." Harry watched numbly as the large, chattering group took their beers from Fred and rummaged in their robes to find coins. He could not imagine what all these people had turned up for until the horrible thought occurred to him that they might be expecting some kind of speech, at which he rounded on Hermione. "What have you been telling people?" he said in a low voice. "What are they expecting?" "I've told you, they just want to hear what you've got to say," said Hermione soothingly. But Harry continued to look at her so furiously that she added quickly, "You don't have to do anything yet. I'll speak to them first." "Hi, Harry," said Neville, beaming and taking a seat opposite him. Harry tried to smile back, but did not speak. His mouth was exceptionally dry. Cho had just smiled at him and sat down on Ron's right. Her friend, who had curly reddish-blonde hair, did not smile, but gave Harry a thoroughly mistrustful look, which plainly told him that, given her way, she would not be here at all. In 2s and 3s, the new arrivals settled around Harry, Ron and Hermione, some looking rather excited, others curious. Luna Lovegood gazed dreamily into space. When everybody had pulled up a chair, the chatter died out. Every eye was upon Harry. Said Hermione, her voice slightly higher than usual out of nerves. Hi." The group focused its attention on her instead, though eyes continued to dart back regularly to Harry. Well, you know why you're here? Harry here had an idea. Harry had thrown her a sharp look. I had the idea that it might be good if people who wanted to study Defence Against the Dark Arts, and really study it, not the rubbish that Umbridge is doing with us. Hermione's voice became suddenly much stronger and more confident, because nobody could call that Defence Against the Dark Arts. "Hear, hear," said Anthony Goldstein, and Hermione looked heartened. "Well, I thought it would be good if we, took matters into our own hands. She paused, looked sideways at Harry and went on. And by that I mean learning how to defend ourselves properly, not just in theory, but doing the real spells. You want to pass your defence against the dark arts owl too, though, I bet, said Michael Corner. Of course I do, said Hermione at once. But more than that, I want to be properly trained in defence because... She took a great breath and finished, because Lord Voldemort is back. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Cho's friend shrieked and slopped butterbeer down herself. Terry Boot gave a kind of involuntary twitch. Padma Patil shuddered, and Neville gave an old yelp that he managed to turn into a cough. All of them, however, looked fixedly, even eagerly at Harry. Well, that's the plan anyway, said Hermione. If you want to join us, we need to decide how we're going to... Where's the proof you know who is back? Said the blonde Hufflepuff player in a rather aggressive voice. Well, Dumbledore believes it, Hermione began. You mean Dumbledore believes him? Said the blonde boy, nodding at Harry. Who are you? Said Ron, rather rudely. Zacharias Smith, said the boy, and I think we've got the right to know exactly what makes him say you know who is back. Look, said Hermione, intervening swiftly, that's really not what this meeting was supposed to be about. It's okay, Hermione, said Harry. It had just dawned on him why there were so many people there. He thought Hermione should have seen this coming. Some of these people, maybe even most of them, had turned up in the hopes of hearing Harry's story firsthand. What makes you say, you know who's back? He asked, looking Zacharias straight in the face. I saw him. But Dumbledore told the whole school what happened last year, and if you didn't believe him, you won't believe me, and I'm not wasting an afternoon trying to convince anyone. The whole group seemed to have held its breath while Harry spoke. Harry had the impression that even the barman was listening. He was wiping the same glass with a filthy rag, making it steadily dirtier. Zacharias said dismissively, all Dumbledore told us last year was that Cedric Diggory was killed by you-know-who, and that you brought Diggory's body back to Hogwarts. He didn't give us details. He didn't tell us exactly how Diggory got murdered. I think we'd all like to know. If you've come to hear exactly what it looks like when Voldemort murders someone, I can't help you, Harry said. His temper, always so close to the surface these days, was rising again. He did not take his eyes off Zacharias Smith's aggressive face and was determined not to look at Cho. I don't want to talk about Cedric Diggory, all right? So if that's what you're here for, you might as well clear out. He cast an angry look in Hermione's direction. This was, he felt, all her fault. She had decided to display him like some sort of freak, and of course they had all turned up to see just how wild his story was, but none of them left their seats, not even Zacharias Smith, though he continued to gaze intently at Harry. So, said Hermione, her voice very high-pitched again, like I was saying, if you want to learn some defence, then we need to work out how we're going to do it, how often we're going to meet and where we're going to... Is it true, interrupted the girl with the long plait down her back, looking at Harry, that you can produce a Patronus? There was a murmur of interest around the group at this. Yeah, said Harry, slightly defensively. A corporeal Patronus? The phrase stirred something in Harry's memory. You don't know Madame Bones, do you? He asked. The girl smiled. She's my auntie, she said. I'm Susan Bones. She told me about your hearing. So, is it really true? You make a stag Patronus? Yes, said Harry. Blimey, Harry, said Lee, looking deeply impressed. I never knew that. Mum told Ron not to spread it around, said Fred, grinning at Harry. She said you got enough attention as it was. She's not wrong, mumbled Harry, and a couple of people laughed. The veiled witch, sitting alone, shifted very slightly in her seat. And did you kill a basilisk with that sword in Dumbledore's office? Demanded Terry Boot. That's what one of the portraits on the wall told me when I was in there last year. Yeah, I did, yeah, said Harry. Justin Finch Fletchley whistled. The Creevy brothers exchanged awe-struck looks, and Lavender Brown said, Wow, softly. Harry was feeling slightly hot around the collar now. He was determinedly looking anywhere but at Cho. And in our first year, said Neville to the group at large, he saved that philological stone. Philosophers, hissed Hermione. Yes, that from you-know-who, finished Neville. Hannah Abbott's eyes were as round as galleons. And that's not to mention, said Cho. Harry's eyes snapped across to her. She was looking at him, smiling. His stomach did another somersault. All the tasks he had to get through in the Triwizard Tournament last year, getting past dragons and mer people and acromantula and things. There was a murmur of impressed agreement around the table. Harry's insides were squirming. He was trying to arrange his face so that he did not look too pleased with himself. The fact that Jo had just praised him made it much, much harder for him to say the thing he had sworn to himself he would tell them. Look, he said, and everyone fell silent at once. I don't want to sound like I'm trying to be modest or anything, but I had a lot of help with all that stuff. Not with the dragon you didn't, said Michael Corner at once. That was a seriously cool bit of flying. Yeah, well, said Harry, feeling it would be churlish to disagree. And nobody helped you get rid of those Dementors this summer, said Susan Bones. No, said Harry. No, okay, I know I did bits of it without help, but the point I'm trying to make is, are you trying to weasel out of showing us any of this stuff, said Zacharias Smith. Here's an idea, said Ron loudly, before Harry could speak. Why don't you shut your mouth? Perhaps the word weasel had affected Ron particularly strongly. In any case, he was now looking at Zacharias as though he would like nothing better than to thump him. Zacharias flushed. Well, we've all turned up to learn from him, and now he's telling us he can't really do any of it, he said. That's not what he said, snarled Fred. Would you like us to clean out your ears for you, inquired George, pulling a long and lethal-looking metal instrument from inside one of the Zonko's bags. Or any part of your body, really. We're not fussy where we stick this, said Fred. Yes, well, said Hermione hastily. Moving on. The point is, are we agreed we want to take lessons from Harry? There was a murmur of general agreement. Zacharias folded his arms and said nothing, though perhaps this was because he was too busy keeping an eye on the instrument in Fred's hand. Right, said Hermione, looking relieved that something had at last been settled. Well then, the next question is how often do we do it? I really don't think there's any point in meeting less than once a week. Hang on, said Angelina. We need to make sure this doesn't clash with our Quidditch practice. No, said Cho, nor with ours. Nor ours, added Zacharias Smith. I'm sure we can find a night that suits everyone, said Hermione, slightly impatiently. But you know, this is rather important. We're talking about learning to defend ourselves against Voldemort's Death Eaters. Well said, barked Ernie Macmillan, who Harry had been expecting to speak long before this. Personally, I think this is really important, possibly more important than anything else we'll do this year, even with our owls coming up. He looked around impressively, as though waiting for people to cry, surely not. When nobody spoke, he went on. I, personally, am at a loss to see why the Ministry has foisted such a useless teacher on us at this critical period. Obviously, they are in denial about the return of you-know-who, but to give us a teacher who is trying to actively prevent us from using defensive spells... We think the reason Umbridge doesn't want us trained in defence against the dark arts, said Hermione, is that she's got some mad idea that Dumbledore could use the students in the school as a kind of private army. She thinks he'd mobilise us against the Ministry. Nearly everybody looked stunned at the news. Everybody except Luna Lovegood, who piped up. Well, that makes sense. After all, Cornelius Fudge has got his own private army. What? Said Harry, completely thrown by this unexpected piece of information. Yes, he's got an army of heliopaths, said Luna solemnly. No, he hasn't, snapped Hermione. Yes, he has, said Luna. What are heliopaths? Asked Neville, looking blank. They're spirits of fire, said Luna, her perturbed eyes widening so that she looked madder than ever. Great, tall, flaming creatures that gallop across the ground, burning everything in front of... They don't exist, Neville, said Hermione tartly. Oh, yes, they do, said Luna angrily. I'm sure, but where's... I'm sorry, but where's the proof of that? Snapped Hermione. There are plenty of eyewitness accounts. Just because you're so narrow-minded, you need to have everything shoved under your nose before you... Ahem, said Ginny, in such a good imitation of Professor Umbridge that several people looked around in alarm and then laughed. Weren't we going to decide how often we're going to meet and have defence lessons? Yes, said Hermione at once. Yes, we were. You're right, Ginny. Well, once a week sounds cool, said Lee Jordan. As long as, began Angelina. Yes, we know about the Quidditch, said Hermione in a tense voice. Well, the other thing to decide is where we're going to meet. This was rather more difficult. The whole group fell silent. Library? Suggested Katie Bell, after a few moments. I can't see Madam Pince being too chuffed with us doing jinxes in the library, said Harry. Maybe an unused classroom, said Dean. Yes, said Ron. McGonagall might let us have hers. She did when Harry was practising for the Triwizard. But Harry was pretty certain that McGonagall would not be so accommodating this time. For all that Hermione had said about study and homework groups being allowed, he had the distinct feeling that this one might be considered a lot more rebellious. Right, well... We'll try to find somewhere, said Hermione. We'll send a message round to everybody when we've got a time and a place for the first meeting. She rummaged in her bag and produced parchment and quill, then hesitated, rather as though she was steeling herself to say something. I think everybody should write their name down, just so we know who was here, but I also think, she took a deep breath, that we all ought to agree not to shout about what we're doing. So if you sign, you're agreeing not to tell Umbridge or anybody else what we're up to. Fred reached out for the parchment and cheerfully wrote his signature, but Harry noticed at once that several people looked less than happy at the prospect of putting their names on the list. Said Zacharias slowly, not taking the parchment that George was trying to pass to him. Well, I'm sure Ernie will tell me when the meeting is. But Ernie was looking rather hesitant about signing too. Hermione raised her eyebrows at him. Well, we are prefects, Ernie burst out, and if this list was found, well, I mean to say, you said yourself, if Umbridge finds out... You just said this group was the most important thing you'd do this year, Harry reminded him. Yes, said Ernie, yes, I do believe that, it's just... Ernie, do you really think I'd leave the list lying around, said Hermione testily. No, of course not, said Ernie, looking slightly less anxious. Yes, of course I'll sign. Nobody raised objections after Ernie, though Harry saw Cho's friend give her a rather reproachful look before adding her own name. When the last person, Zacharias, had signed, Hermione took the parchment back and slipped it carefully into her bag. There was an odd feeling in the group now. It was as though they had just signed some kind of contract. Well, time's ticking on, said Fred briskly, getting to his feet. George Lee and I have got items of sensitive nature to purchase. We'll be seeing you all later. In twos and threes, the rest of the group took their leave too. Cho made rather a business of fastening the catch on her bag before leaving, her long dark curtain of hair swinging forwards to hide her face. But her friend stood beside her, arms folded, clicking her tongue, so that Cho had little choice but to leave with her. As her friend ushered her through the door, Cho looked back and waved at Harry. Well, I think that went quite well, said Hermione happily, as she, Harry and Ron walked out of the Hog's Head into the bright sunlight a few moments later. Harry and Ron were clutching their bottles of butterbeer. That Zacharias bloke's a wart, said Ron, who was glowering after the figure of Smith, just discernible in the distance. I don't like him much either, admitted Hermione, but he overheard me talking to Ernie and Hannah at the Hufflepuff table, and he seemed really interested in coming. So what could I say? But the more people, the better, really. I mean, Michael Corner and his friends couldn't have come if he hadn't been going out with Ginny. Ron, who had been draining the last few drops from his butterbeer bottle, gagged and sprayed butterbeer down his front. He's what? Spluttered Ron, outraged, his ears now resembling curls of raw beef. She's going out with... My sister's going... What do you mean, Michael Corner? Well, that's why he and his friends came, I think. Well, they're obviously interested in learning defence, but if Ginny hadn't told Michael what was going on... When did she? They met at the Yule Ball and got together at the end of last year, said Hermione composedly. They had turned into the High Street and she paused outside Shrivenshaft's quill shop, where there was a handsome display of pheasant feather quills in the window. I could do with a new quill. She turned into the shop. Harry and Ron followed her. Which one was Michael Corner? Ron demanded furiously. The dark one, said Hermione. I didn't like him, said Ron at once. Big surprise, said Hermione under her breath. But, said Ron, following Hermione along a row of quills in copper pots. I thought Ginny fancied Harry. Hermione looked at him rather pityingly and shook her head. Ginny used to fancy Harry, but she gave up on him months ago. Not that she doesn't like you, of course, she added kindly to Harry, while she examined a long black and gold quill. Harry, whose head was still full of Cho's parting wave, did not find this subject quite as interesting as Ron, who was positively quivering with indignation, but it did bring something home to him that until now he had not really registered. So, that's why she talks now. That's why, he asked Hermione. She never used to talk in front of me. Exactly, said Hermione. Yes, I think I'll have this one. She went up to the counter and handed over 15 sickles and 2 nuts, with Ron still breathing down her neck. Ron, she said severely as she turned and trod on his feet, this is exactly why Ginny hasn't told you she's seeing Michael. She knew you'd take it badly. So don't harp on about it, for heaven's sake. What do you mean? Who's taking anything badly? I'm not going to harp on about anything. Ron continued to chunter under his breath all the way down the street. Hermione rolled her eyes at Harry and then said in an undertone, while Ron was still muttering imprecations about Michael Corner, and talking about Michael and Ginny, what about Cho and you? What do you mean? Said Harry quickly. It was as though boiling water was rising rapidly inside him, a burning sensation that was causing his face to smart in the cold. Had he been that obvious? Well, said Hermione, smiling slightly, she just couldn't keep her eyes off you, could she? Harry had never been appreciated just how beautiful the village of Hogsmeade was. Chapter 17. Educational Decree Number 24. Harry felt happier for the rest of the weekend than he had done in all term. He and Ron spent much of Sunday catching up with all their homework again, and although this could hardly be called fun, the last burst of autumn sunshine persisted, so rather than sitting hunched over tables in the common room, they took their work outside and lounged in the shade of a large beech tree on the edge of the lake. Hermione, who of course was up to date with all her work, brought more wool inside with her and bewitched her knitting needles so that they flashed and clicked in mid-air beside her, producing more hats and scarves. Knowing they were doing something to resist Umbridge and the Ministry, and that he was a key part of the rebellion, gave Harry a feeling of immense satisfaction. He kept reliving Saturday's meeting in his mind, all those people coming to him to learn defence against the dark arts, and the looks on their faces as they had heard some of the things he had done, and Cho praising his performance in the Triwizard Tournament, knowing all those people did not think him a lying weirdo, but someone to be admired, buoyed him up so much that he was still cheerful on Monday morning, despite the imminent prospect of all his least favourite classes. He and Ron headed downstairs from their dormitory, discussing Angelina's idea that they were to work on a new move called the sloth grip roll during the night's Quidditch practice, and not until they were halfway across the sunlit common room did they notice the addition to the room that had already attracted the attention of a small group of people. A large sign had been affixed to the Gryffindor notice board, so large it covered everything else on it. The lists of second-hand spell books for sale, the regular reminders of school rules from Argus Filch, the Quidditch team training timetable, the offers to barter certain chocolate frog cards for others, the Weasleys' latest advertisement for testers, the dates of the Hogsmeade weekends, and the lost and found notices. The new sign was printed in large black letters, and there was a highly official-looking seal at the bottom, beside a neat and curly signature. By order of the High Inquisitor of Hogwarts, all student organisations, societies, teams, groups and clubs are henceforth disbanded. An organisation, society, team, group or club is hereby defined as a regular meeting of 3 or more students. Permission to reform may be sought from the High Inquisitor, Professor Umbridge. No student, organisation, society, team, group or club may exist without the knowledge and approval of the High Inquisitor. Any student found to have formed or to belong to an organisation, society, team, group or club that has not been approved by the High Inquisitor will be expelled. The above is in accordance with Educational Decree number 24, signed Dolores Jane Umbridge, High Inquisitor. Harry and Ron read the notice over the heads of some anxious-looking second years. "Does this mean they're going to shut down the Gobstones Club?" one of them asked his friend. "I reckon you'll be okay with gobstones," Ron said darkly, making the second year jump. "I don't think we're going to be as lucky, though. Do you?" he asked Harry as the second years hurried away. Harry was reading the notice through again. The happiness that had filled him since Saturday was gone. His insides were pulsing with rage. "This isn't a coincidence," he said, his hands forming fists. "She knows." "She can't," said Ron at once. "There were people listening in at the pub, and let's face it, we don't know how many of the people who turned up we can trust. Any of them could have run off and told Umbridge." And he had thought they believed him, thought they even admired him. "Zachariah Smith," said Ron at once, punching a fist into his hand. Or, "I thought that Michael Corner had a really shifty look too." "I wonder if Hermione's seen this yet," Harry said, looking around at the door to the girls' dormitories. "Let's go and tell her," said Ron. He bounded forwards, pulled open the door, and set off up the spiral staircase. He was on the 6th stair when there was a loud, wailing, klaxon-like sound, and the steps melted together to make a long, smooth stone slide like a helter-skelter. There was a brief moment when Ron tried to keep running, arms working madly like windmills. Then he toppled over backwards and shot down the newly created slide, coming to rest on his back at Harry's feet. I don't think we're allowed to go to the girls' dormitories," said Harry, pulling Ron to his feet and trying not to laugh. 2 fourth-year girls came zooming gleefully down the stone slide. "Ooh, we tried to get upstairs," they giggled happily, leaping to their feet and ogling Harry and Ron. "Me," said Ron, who was still rather dishevelled. "I didn't realise that would happen. It's not fair," he added to Harry as the girls headed off for the portrait hole, still giggling madly. "Hermione's allowed in our dormitory. How come we're not allowed?" "Well, it's an old-fashioned rule," said Hermione, who had just slid neatly onto a rug in front of them and was now getting to her feet. "But it says in Hogwarts a history that the founders thought boys were less trustworthy than girls. Anyway, why were you trying to get in there?" "To see you. Look at this," said Ron, dragging her over to the notice board. Hermione's eyes slid rapidly down on the notice. Her expression became stony. "Someone must have blabbed to her," Ron said angrily. "They can't have done," said Hermione in a low voice. "You're so naive," said Ron. "You think just because you're all honourable and trustworthy..." No, they can't have done, because I put a jinx on that piece of parchment we all signed, said Hermione grimly. Believe me, if anyone's run off and told Umbridge, we'll know exactly who they are, and they will really regret it. What'll happen to them? Said Ron eagerly. Well, put it this way, said Hermione. It'll make Eloise Midgen's acne look like a couple of cute freckles. Come on, let's get down to breakfast and see what the others think. I wonder whether this has been put up in all the houses. It was immediately apparent on entering the Great Hall that Umbridge's sign had not only appeared in Gryffindor Tower. There was a peculiar intensity about the chatter and an extra measure of movement in the hall as people scurried up and down their tables, conferring on what they had read. Harry, Ron and Hermione had barely taken their seats when Neville, Dean, Fred, George and Ginny descended upon them. Did you see it? Do you reckon she knows? What are we going to do? They were all looking at Harry. He glanced around to make sure there were no teachers near them. We're going to do it anyway, of course, he said quietly. Knew you'd say that, said George, beaming and thumping Harry on the arm. The prefects as well, said Fred, looking quizzically at Ron and Hermione. Of course, said Hermione coolly. Here come Ernie and Hannah Abbott, said Ron, looking over his shoulder. And those Ravenclaw blokes and Smith, and no one looks very spotty. Hermione looked alarmed. Never mind spots, the idiots can't come over here now, it'll look really suspicious. Sit down, she mouthed to Ernie and Hannah, gesturing frantically to them to rejoin the Hufflepuff table. Later, we'll talk to you later. I'll tell Michael, said Ginny impatiently, swinging herself off her bench. The fool, honestly. She hurried off towards the Ravenclaw table. Harry watched her go. Cho was sitting not far away, talking to the curly-haired friend she had brought along to the Hog's Head. Would Umbridge's notice scare her off meeting them again? But the full repercussions of the sign were not felt until they were leaving the Great Hall for History of Magic. Harry! Ron! It was Angelina, and she was hurrying towards them, looking perfectly desperate. It's okay, said Harry quietly, when she was near enough to hear them. We're still going to... You realise she's including Quidditch in this? Angelina said over him. We have to go and ask permission to reform the Gryffindor team. What? Said Harry. No way, said Ron, appalled. You read the sign. It mentions teams too. So listen, Harry, I'm saying this for the last time. Please, please don't lose your temper with Umbridge again, or she might not let us play any more. Okay, said Harry, for Angelina looked as though she was on the verge of tears. Don't worry, I'll behave myself. Bet Umbridge is in History of Magic, said Ron grimly, as they set off for Binns' lessons. She hasn't inspected Binns yet. Bet you anything she's there. But he was wrong. The only teacher present when they entered was Professor Binns, floating an inch or so above the chair as usual, and preparing to continue the monotonous drone on Giant Wars. Harry did not even attempt to follow what he was saying today. He doodled idly on his parchment, ignoring Hermione's frequent glares and nudges, until a particularly painful poke in the ribs made him look up angrily. What? She pointed at the window. Harry looked around. Hedwig was perched on the narrow window ledge, gazing through the thick glass at him, a letter tied to her leg. Harry could not understand it. They'd just had breakfast. Why on earth hadn't she delivered the letter then? As usual, many of his classmates were pointing out Hedwig to each other too. Oh, I've always loved that owl. She's so beautiful, Harry heard Lavender sigh to Parvati. He glanced around at Professor Binns, who continued to read his notes, serenely unaware that the class's attention was even less focused upon him than usual. Harry slipped quietly off his chair, crouched down and hurried along the row to the window, where he slid the catch and opened it very slowly. He had expected Hedwig to hold out her legs so that he could remove the letter and then fly off to the owlery, but the moment the window was open wide enough, she hopped inside, hooting dolefully. He closed the window with an anxious glance at Professor Binns, crouched low again, and sped back to his seat, with Hedwig on his shoulder. He regained his seat, transferred Hedwig to his lap, and made to remove the letter tied to her leg. Only then did he realise that Hedwig's feathers were oddly ruffled. Some were bent the wrong way, and she was holding one of her wings at an odd angle. She's hurt, Harry whispered, bending his head low over her. Hermione and Ron leaned in closer. Hermione even put down her quill. Look, there's something wrong with her wing. Hedwig was quivering. When Harry made to touch the wing, she gave a little jump, all her feathers on end, as though she was inflating herself, and gazed at him reproachfully. Professor Binns, said Harry loudly, and everyone in the class turned to look at him. I'm not feeling well. Professor Binns raised his eyes from his notes, looking amazed, as always, to find the room in front of him full of people. Not feeling well, he repeated hazily. Not at all well, said Harry firmly, getting to his feet with Hedwig concealed behind his back. I think I need to go to the hospital wing. Yes, said Professor Binns, clearly very much wrong-footed. Yes, hospital wing. Well, off you go then, Perkins. Once outside the room, Harry returned Hedwig to his shoulder and hurried off up the corridor, pausing to think only when he was out of sight of Bin's door. His first choice of somebody to cure Hedwig would have been Hagrid, of course, but as he had no idea where Hagrid was, his only remaining option was to find Professor Grubbly Plank and hope she could help. He peered out of a window at the blustery, overcast grounds. There was no sign of her anywhere near Hagrid's cabin. If she was not teaching, she was probably in the staff room. He set off downstairs, Hedwig hooting feebly as she swayed on his shoulder. 2 stone gargoyles flanked the staff room door. As Harry approached, one of them croaked, "You should be in class, Sonny Jim." "This is urgent," said Harry curtly. "Oh, urgent, is it?" said the other gargoyle in a high-pitched voice. "Well, that puts us in our place, hasn't it?" Harry knocked. He heard footsteps. Then the door opened and he found himself face to face with Professor McGonagall. "You haven't been given another detention," she said at once, her square spectacles flashing alarmingly. "No, Professor," said Harry hastily. "Well then, why are you out of class?" "It's urgent, apparently," said the second gargoyle snidely. "I'm looking for Professor Grubbly Plank," Harry explained. "It's my owl. She's injured." "Injured owl, did you say?" Professor Grubbly Plank appeared at Professor McGonagall's shoulder, smoking a pipe and holding a copy of the Daily Prophet. "Yes," said Harry, lifting Hedwig carefully off his shoulder. "She turned up after the other post owls, and her wing's all funny, look." Professor Grubbly Plank stuck her pipe firmly between her teeth and took Hedwig from Harry while Professor McGonagall watched. Said Professor Grubbly Plank, her pipe waggling slightly as she talked. "Looks like somebody's attacked her. Can't think what would have done it, though. Frestrals will sometimes go for birds, of course, but Hagrid's got the Hogwarts Frestrals well trained not to touch owls." Harry neither knew nor cared what Festrals were. He just wanted to know that Hedwig was going to be all right. Professor McGonagall, however, looked sharply at Harry and said, "Do you know how far this owl's travelled, Potter?" Said Harry. "From London, I think." He met her eyes briefly and knew, by the way her eyebrows had joined in the middle, that she understood London to mean number 12 Grimmauld Place. Professor Grubbly Plank pulled a monocle out of the inside of her robes and screwed it into her eye to examine Hedwig's wing closely. "I should be able to sort this out if you leave her with me, Potter," she said. "She shouldn't be flying long distances for a few days in any case." Right, thanks," said Harry, just as the bell rang for break. "No problem," said Professor Grubbly Plank gruffly, turning back into the staff room. "Just a moment, Wilhelmina," said Professor McGonagall. "Potter's letter." "Oh, yeah," said Harry, who had momentarily forgotten the scroll tied to Hedwig's leg. Professor Grubbly Plank handed it over and then disappeared into the staff room carrying Hedwig, who was staring at Harry as though unable to believe he would give her away like this. Feeling slightly guilty, he turned to go, but Professor McGonagall called him back. "Potter?" Yes, Professor?" She glanced up and down the corridor. There were students coming from both directions. "Bear in mind," she said quickly and quietly, her eyes on the scroll in his hand, "that channels of communication in and out of Hogwarts may be being watched. Won't you?" Said Harry, but the flood of students rolling along the corridor was almost upon him. Professor McGonagall gave him a curt nod and retreated into the staff room, leaving Harry to be swept out into the courtyard with the crowd. He spotted Ron and Hermione already standing in a sheltered corner, their cloak collars turned up against the wind. Harry slit open the scroll as he hurried towards them and found 5 words in Sirius's handwriting. "Today, same time, same place." "Is Hedwig okay?" asked Hermione anxiously, the moment he was within earshot. "Where did you take her?" asked Ron. "To Grubbly Plank," said Harry, "and I met McGonagall. Listen." And he told them what Professor McGonagall had said. To his surprise, neither of the others looked shocked. On the contrary, they exchanged significant looks. "What?" said Harry, looking from Ron to Hermione and back again. "Well, I was just saying to Ron, what if someone had tried to intercept Hedwig? I mean, she's never been hurt on a flight before, has she?" "Who's the letter from, anyway?" asked Ron, taking the note from Harry. "Snuffles," said Harry quietly. "Same time, same place. Does he mean the fire in the common room?" "Obviously," said Hermione, also reading the note. She looked uneasy. "I just hope nobody else has read this." "But it was still sealed and everything," said Harry, trying to convince himself as much as her, "and nobody would understand what it meant if they didn't know where we'd been spoken to him before, would they?" "I don't know," said Hermione anxiously, hitching her bag back over her shoulder as the bell rang again. "It wouldn't be exactly difficult to re-seal the scroll by magic, and if anyone's watching the Flu Network, but I don't really see how we can warn him not to come without that being intercepted too." They trudged down the stone steps to the dungeons for potions, all three of them lost in thought, but as they reached the bottom of the steps, they were recalled to themselves by the voice of Draco Malfoy, who was standing just outside Snape's classroom door, waving around an official-looking piece of parchment, and talking much louder than was necessary, so that they could hear every word. "Yeah, Umbridge gave the Slytherin Quidditch team permission to continue playing straight away. I went to ask her first thing this morning. Well, it was pretty much automatic. I mean, she knows my father really well. He's always popping in and out of the ministry. It'll be interesting to see whether Gryffindor are allowed to keep playing, won't it?" "Don't rise," Hermione whispered imploringly to Harry and Ron, who were both watching Malfoy, faces set and fists clenched. "It's what he wants." "I mean," said Malfoy, raising his voice a little more, his grey eyes glittering malevolently in Harry and Ron's direction. "If it's a question of influence with the ministry, I don't think they've got much chance. From what my father says, they've been looking for an excuse to sack Arthur Weasley for years. And as for Potter, my father says it's a matter of time before the ministry has him carted off to St. Mungo's. Apparently they've got a special ward for people whose brains have been addled by magic." Malfoy made a grotesque face, his mouth sagging open and his eyes rolling. Crabbe and Goyle gave their usual grunts of laughter. Pansy Parkinson shrieked with glee. Something collided hard with Harry's shoulder, knocking him sideways. A split second later he realised that Neville had just charged past him, heading straight for Malfoy. "Neville, no!" Harry leapt forward and seized the back of Neville's robes. Neville struggled frantically, his fists flailing, trying desperately to get at Malfoy, who looked for a moment extremely shocked. "Help me!" Harry flung at Ron, managing to get an arm around Neville's neck and dragging him backwards, away from the Slytherins. Crabbe and Goyle were flexing their arms as they stepped in front of Malfoy, ready for the fight. Ron seized Neville's arms, and together he and Harry succeeded in dragging Neville back into the Gryffindor line. Neville's face was scarlet. The pressure Harry was exerting on his throat rendered him quite incomprehensible, but odd words spluttered from his mouth. "Not funny! Don't Mungo's show him!" The dungeon door opened, and Snape appeared there. His black eyes swept up the Gryffindor line to the point where Harry and Ron were wrestling with Neville. "Fighting Potter, Weasley, Longbottom," Snape said in his cold, sneering voice. 10 points from Gryffindor. Release Longbottom, Potter, or it will be detention. Inside, all of you." Harry let go of Neville, who stood panting and glaring at him. "I had to stop you," Harry gasped, picking up his bag. "Crabbe and Goyle would have torn you apart." Neville said nothing. He merely snatched up his own bag and stalked off into the dungeon. "What in the name of Merlin," said Ron slowly, as they followed Neville, "was that about?" Harry did not answer. He knew exactly why the subject of people who were in St. Mungo's because of magical damage to their brains was highly distressing to Neville, but he had sworn to Dumbledore that he would not tell anyone Neville's secret. Even Neville did not know Harry knew. Harry, Ron and Hermione took their usual seats at the back of the class, pulled out parchment, quills and their copies of 1,000 magical herbs and fungi. The class around them was whispering about what Neville had just done, but when Snape closed the dungeon door with an echoing bang, everybody immediately fell silent. "You will notice," said Snape in his low, sneering voice, "that we have a guest with us today." He gestured towards the dim corner of the dungeon, and Harry saw Professor Umbridge sitting there, clipboard on her knee. He glanced sideways at Ron and Hermione, his eyebrows raised. Snape and Umbridge, the two teachers he hated most. It was hard to decide which one he wanted to triumph over the other. "We are continuing with our strengthening solution today. You will find your mixtures as you left them last lesson. If correctly made, they should have matured well over the weekend. Instructions." He waved his wand again. "On the board. Carry on." Professor Umbridge spent the first half hour of the lesson making notes in her corner. Harry was very interested in hearing her question Snape, so interested that he was becoming careless with his potion again. "Salamander blood, Harry," Hermione moaned, grabbing his wrist to prevent him adding the wrong ingredient for the third time. "Not pomegranate juice." "Right," said Harry vaguely, putting down the bottle and continuing to watch the corner. Umbridge had just got to her feet. "Ha!" he said softly, as she strode between two lines of desks towards Snape, who was bending over Dean Thomas's cauldron. "Well, the class seem fairly advanced for their level," she said briskly to Snape's back, "though I would question whether it's advisable to teach them a potion like the strengthening solution. I think the ministry would prefer it if that was removed from the syllabus." Snape straightened up slowly and turned to look at her. "Now, how long have you been teaching at Hogwarts?" she asked, her quill poised over her clipboard. 14 years, Snape replied. His expression was unfathomable. His eyes on Snape. Harry added a few drops to his potion. It hissed menacingly and turned from turquoise to orange. You applied first for the Defence Against the Dark Arts post, I believe, Professor Umbridge asked Snape. Yes, said Snape quietly. But you were unsuccessful. Snape's lip curled. Obviously. Professor Umbridge scribbled on her clipboard. And you have applied regularly for the Defence Against the Dark Art post since you first joined the school, I believe. Yes, said Snape quietly, barely moving his lips. He looked very angry. Do you have any idea why Dumbledore has consistently refused to appoint you? Asked Umbridge. I suggest you ask him, said Snape jerkily. Oh, I shall, said Professor Umbridge with a sweet smile. I suppose this is relevant, Snape asked. His black eyes narrowed. Oh, yes, said Professor Umbridge. Yes, the Ministry wants a thorough understanding of teachers' backgrounds. She turned away, walked over to Pansy Parkinson, and began questioning her about the lessons. Snape looked around at Harry, and their eyes met for a second. Harry hastily dropped his gaze to his potion, which was now congealing foully and giving off a strong smell of burned rubber. No marks again, then, Potter, said Snape maliciously, emptying Harry's cauldron with a wave of his wand. You will write me an essay on the correct composition of this potion, indicating how and why you went wrong, to be handed in next lesson. Do you understand? Yes, said Harry furiously. Snape had already given him homework, and he had Quidditch practice this evening. This would mean another couple of sleepless nights. It did not seem possible that he had awoken that morning feeling very happy. All he felt now was a fervent desire for this day to end. Maybe I'll skive off divination, he said glumly, as they stood in the courtyard after lunch, the wind whipping at the hems of robes and brims of hats. I'll pretend to be ill and do Snape's essay instead. Then I won't have to stay up half the night. You can't skive off divination, said Hermione severely. Hark who's talking. You walked out of divination. You hate Trelawney, said Ron indignantly. I don't hate her, said Hermione loftily. I just think she's an absolutely appalling teacher and a real old fraud. But Harry's already missed History of Magic, and I don't think he ought to miss anything else today. There was too much truth in this to ignore, so half an hour later Harry took his seat in the hot, over-perfumed atmosphere of the divination classroom, feeling angry at everybody. Professor Trelawney was yet again handing out copies of the Dream Oracle. Harry thought he'd surely be much better employed doing Snape's punishment essay than sitting here trying to find meaning in a lot of made-up dreams. It seemed, however, that he was not the only person in divination who was in a temper. Professor Trelawney slammed a copy of the Oracle down on the table between Harry and Ron and swept away, her lips pursed. She threw the next copy of the Oracle at Seamus and Dean, narrowly avoiding Seamus's head, and thrust the final one into Neville's chest with such force that he slipped off his poof. Well, carry on, said Professor Trelawney loudly, her voice high-pitched and somewhat hysterical. You know what to do, or am I such a substandard teacher that you have never learned how to open a book? The class stared perplexed at her, then at each other. Harry, however, thought he knew what was the matter. As Professor Trelawney flounced back to the high-backed teacher's chair, her magnified eyes full of angry tears, he leaned his head closer to Ron's and muttered, I think she's got the results of her inspection back. Professor, said Parvati Patil in a hushed voice. She and Lavender had always rather admired Professor Trelawney. Professor, is there anything, wrong? Wrong, cried Professor Trelawney, in a voice throbbing with emotion. Certainly not. I have been insulted, certainly. Insinuations have been made against me, unfounded accusations levelled, but no, there's nothing wrong, certainly not. She took a great shuddering breath and looked away from Parvati, angry tears spilling from under her glasses. I say nothing, she choked, of 16 years of devoted service. It has passed apparently unnoticed, but I shall not be insulted. No, I shall not. But, Professor, who's insulting you? Asked Parvati timidly. The establishment, said Professor Trelawney in a deep, dramatic, wavering voice. Yes, those with eyes too clouded by the mundane to see as I see, as to know as I know. Of course, we seers have always been feared, always persecuted. It is, alas, our fate. She gulped, dabbed at her wet cheeks with the end of her shawl, and then she pulled a small embroidered handkerchief from her sleeve and blew her nose very hard with a sound like Peeves blowing a raspberry. Ron sniggered. Lavender shot him a disgusted look. Professor, said Parvati, do you mean... is it something Professor Umbridge? Do not speak to me about that woman, cried Professor Trelawney, leaping to her feet, her beads rattling and her spectacles flashing. Kindly continue with your work. And she spent the rest of the lesson striding among them, tears still leaking from behind her glasses, muttering what sounded like threats under her breath. May well choose to leave. The indignity of it. On probation. We shall see. How she dares. You and Umbridge have got something in common, Harry told Hermione quietly when they met again in Defence Against the Dark Arts. She obviously reckons Trelawney's an old fraud too. Looks like she put her on probation. Umbridge entered the room as he spoke, wearing her black velvet bow and an expression of great smugness. Good afternoon, class. Good afternoon, Professor Umbridge, they chanted drearily. Wands away, please. But there was no answering flurry of movement this time. Nobody had bothered to take out their wands. Please turn to page 34 of Defence Magical Theory and read the third chapter entitled The Case for Non-Offensive Responses to Magical Attack. There will be... No need to talk, Harry, Ron and Hermione said together under their breaths. No Quidditch practice, said Angelina in hollow tones when Harry, Ron and Hermione entered the common room after dinner that night. But I kept my temper, said Harry, horrified. I didn't say anything to her. Angelina, I swear, I know. I know, said Angelina miserably. She just said she needed a bit of time to consider. Consider what? Said Ron angrily. She's given the Slytherins permission, why not us? But Harry could imagine how much Umbridge was enjoying holding the threat of no Gryffindor Quidditch team over their heads, and could easily understand why she would not want to relinquish that weapon over them too soon. Well, said Hermione, look on the bright side. At least now you'll have time to do Snape's essay. That's a bright side, is it? Snapped Harry, while Ron stared incredulously at Hermione. No Quidditch practice and extra potions. Harry slumped down into a chair, dragged his potions essay reluctantly from his bag and set to work. It was very hard to concentrate, even though he knew Sirius was not due in the fire until much later. He could not help glancing into the flames every few minutes just in case. There was also an incredible amount of noise in the room. Fred and George appeared finally to have perfected one type of skiving snack box, which they were taking turns to demonstrate to a cheering and whooping crowd. First, Fred would take a bite out of the orange end of a chew, at which he would vomit spectacularly into a bucket they had placed in front of them. Then he would force down the purple end of the chew, at which the vomiting would immediately cease. Lee Jordan, who was assisting the demonstration, was lazily vanishing the vomit at regular intervals with the same vanishing spell Snape kept using on Harry's potions. What with the regular sounds of retching, cheering, and the sound of Fred and George taking advance orders from the crowd, Harry was finding it exceptionally difficult to focus on the correct method for strengthening solution. Hermione was not helping matters. The cheers and the sound of vomit hitting the bottom of Fred and George's bucket were punctuated by her loud and disapproving sniffs, which Harry found, if anything, more distracting. Just go and stop them then, he said irritably, after crossing out the wrong weight of powdered Gryffindor for the fourth time. I can't. They're not technically doing anything wrong, said Hermione through gritted teeth. They're quite within their rights to eat the foul things themselves, and I can't find a rule that says the other idiots aren't entitled to buy them, not unless they're proven to be dangerous in some way, and it doesn't look as though they are. She, Harry and Ron watched George projectile vomit into the bucket, gulp down the rest of the chew and straighten up, beaming with his arms wide, to a protracted applause. You know, I don't get why Fred and George only got 3 owls each, said Harry, watching as Fred, George and Lee collected gold from the eager crowd. They really know their stuff. Oh, they only know flashy stuff that's no real use to anyone, said Hermione disparagingly. No real use, said Ron in a strained voice. Hermione, they've made about 26 galleons already. It was a long while before the crowd around the Weasley twins dispersed, and then Fred, Lee and George sat up counting their takings even longer. So it was well past midnight when Harry, Ron and Hermione finally had the common room to themselves. At long last, Fred had closed the doorway to the boys' dormitories behind him, rattling his box of galleons ostentatiously, so that Hermione scowled. Harry, who was making very little progress with his potions essay, decided to give it up for the night. As he put his books away, Ron, who was dozing lightly in an armchair, gave a muffled grunt, awoke and looked blearily into the fire. Sirius, he said. Harry whipped around. Sirius's untidy dark beard was sitting in the fire again. Hi, he said, grinning. Hi, chorused Harry, Ron and Hermione, all three kneeling down on the hearthrug. Crookshanks purred loudly and approached the fire, trying, despite the heat, to put his face close to Sirius's. How are things? Said Sirius. Not that good, said Harry, as Hermione pulled Crookshanks back to stop him, singeing his whiskers. The Ministry's forced through another decree, which means we're not allowed to have Quidditch teams. Or secret defence against the dark arts groups, said Sirius. There was a short pause. How did you know about that? Harry demanded. You want to choose your meeting places more carefully, said Sirius, grinning still more broadly. The Hog's Head, I ask you. Well, it was better than the Free Broomstick, said Hermione defensively. That's always packed with people. Which means you've been harder to overhear, said Sirius. You've got a lot to learn, Hermione. Who overheard us? Harry demanded. Mundungus, of course, said Sirius. And when they all looked puzzled, he laughed. He was the witch under the veil. That was Mundungus, Harry said, stunned. What was he doing in the Hog's Head? What do you think he was doing? Said Sirius impatiently. Keeping an eye on you, of course. I'm still being followed? Asked Harry angrily. Yeah, you are, said Sirius, and just as well, isn't it? If the first thing you're going to do on your weekend off is to organise an illegal defence group. But he looked neither angry nor worried. On the contrary, he was looking at Harry with distinct pride. Why was Dung hiding from us? Asked Ron, sounding disappointed. We'd have liked to have seen him. He was banned from the Hog's Head 20 years ago, said Sirius, and that barman's got a long memory. We lost Moody's spare invisibility cloak when Sturgis was arrested, so Dung's been dressing as a witch a lot lately. Anyway, first of all, Ron, I've sworn to pass on a message from your mother. Oh yes, said Ron, sounding apprehensive. She says on no account whatsoever are you to take part in an illegal, secret defence against the dark arts group. She says you'll be expelled for sure, and your future will be ruined. She says there will be plenty of time to learn how to defend yourself later, and that you are too young to be worrying about that right now. She also, Sirius's eyes turned to the other two, advises Harry and Hermione not to proceed with the group, which she accepts that she had no authority over either of them and simply begs them to remember that she has their best interests at heart. She would have written all this to you, but if the owl had been intercepted, you'd have all been in real trouble, and she can't say it for herself because she's on duty tonight. On duty doing what? Said Ron quickly. Never you mind, just stuff for the order, said Sirius. So it's fallen to me to be the messenger, and make sure you tell her I passed it all on, because I don't think she trusts me too. There was another pause, in which Crookshanks, mewing, attempted to paw Sirius's head, and Ron fiddled with a hole in the hearthrug. So, you want me to say I'm going to take part in the defence group? Or not going to take part in the defence group? He muttered finally. Me? Certainly not, said Sirius, looking surprised. I think it's an excellent idea. You do, said Harry, his heart lifting. Of course I do, said Sirius. Do you think your father and I would have lain down and taken orders from an old hag like Umbridge? But last term, all you did was tell me to be careful and not take risks. Last year all the evidence was that someone inside Hogwarts was trying to kill you. Harry, said Sirius impatiently, this year we know there's someone outside Hogwarts who'd like to kill us all, so I think learning to defend yourselves properly is a very good idea. And if we do get expelled? Hermione asked, a quizzical look on her face. Hermione, this whole thing was your idea, said Harry, staring at her. I know it was. I just wondered what Sirius thought, she said, shrugging. Well, better expelled and able to defend yourselves than sitting safely in school without a clue, said Sirius. Hear, hear, said Harry and Ron enthusiastically. So, said Sirius, how are you organising this group? Where are you meeting? Well, that's a bit of a problem now, said Harry. Don't know where we're going to be able to go. How about the Shrieking Shack, suggested Sirius. Hey, that's an idea, said Ron excitedly, but Hermione made a sceptical noise, and all three of them looked at her. Sirius's head turned in the flames. Well, Sirius, it's just that there were only 4 of you meeting in the Shrieking Shack when you were at school, said Hermione, and all of you could transform into animals, and I suppose you could all have squeezed under a single invisibility cloak if you wanted to, but there are 28 of us, and none of us is an animagus, so we wouldn't need so much as an invisibility cloak as an invisibility marquee. Fair point, said Sirius, looking slightly crestfallen. Well, I'm sure you'll come up with somewhere. There used to be a pretty roomy secret passageway behind that big mirror on the 4th floor. You might have enough space to practice jinxes in there. Fred and George told me it's blocked, said Harry, shaking his head. Caved in or something. Oh, said Sirius, frowning. Well, I'll have to think and get back to you. He broke off. His face was suddenly tense, alarmed. He turned sideways, apparently looking into the solid brick wall of the fireplace. Sirius? Said Harry anxiously. But he had vanished. Harry gaped at the flames for a moment, then turned to look at Ron and Hermione. Why did he? Hermione gave a horrified gasp and leapt to her feet, still staring at the fire. A hand had appeared amongst the flames, groping as though to catch hold of something, a stubby, short-fingered hand covered in ugly old-fashioned rings. The 3 of them ran for it. At the door of the boys' dormitory, Harry looked back. Umbridge's hand was still making snatching movements amongst the flames, as though she knew exactly where Sirius's hair had been moments before and was determined to seize it. Chapter 18. Dumbledore's Army. Umbridge has been reading your mail, Harry. There's no other explanation. You think Umbridge attacked Hedwig? He said, outraged. And one was certain of it, said Hermione grimly. Watch your frog. It's escaping. Harry pointed his wand at the bullfrog that had been hopping hopefully towards the other side of the table. Accio! And it zoomed gloomily back into his hand. Charms was always one of the best lessons in which to enjoy a private chat. There was generally so much movement and activity that the danger of being overheard was very slight. Today, with the room full of croaking bullfrogs and cawing ravens, and with a heavy downpour of rain clattering and pounding against the classroom windows, Harry, Ron and Hermione's whispered discussion about how Umbridge had nearly caught Sirius went quite unnoticed. I've been suspecting this ever since Filch accused you of ordering dung bombs because it seemed such a stupid lie, Hermione whispered. I mean, once your letter had been read, it would have been quite clear you weren't ordering them, so you wouldn't have been in trouble at all. It's a bit of a feeble joke, isn't it? But then I thought, what if somebody just wanted an excuse to read your mail? Well then, it would be a perfect way for Umbridge to manage it. Tip off Filch, let him do the dirty work and confiscate the letter. Then either find a way of stealing it from him or else demand to see it. I don't think Filch would object. When has he ever stuck up for the students' rights? Harry, you're squashing your frog. Harry looked down. He was indeed squeezing his bullfrog so tightly its eyes were popping. He replaced it hastily upon the desk. It was a very, very close call last night, said Hermione. I just wonder if Umbridge knows how close it was. Silencio. The bullfrog, on which she was practising her silencing charm, was struck dumb mid-croak and glared at her reproachfully. If she'd caught Snuffles. Harry finished the sentence for her. He'd probably be back in Azkaban this morning. He waved his wand without really concentrating. His bullfrog swelled like a green balloon and emitted a high-pitched whistle. Silencio, said Hermione hastily, pointing her wand at Harry's frog, which deflated silently before them. Well, he mustn't do it again, that's all. I just don't know how we're going to let him know. We can't send him an owl. I don't reckon he'll risk it again, said Ron. He's not stupid. He knows she nearly got him. Silencio. The large and ugly raven in front of him let out a derisive caw. Silencio! Silencio! The raven cawed more loudly. It's the way you're moving your wand, said Hermione, watching Ron critically. You don't want to wave it, it's more of a sharp jab. Ravens are harder than frogs, said Ron testily. Fine, let's swap, said Hermione, seizing Ron's raven and replacing it with her own fat bullfrog. Silencio! The raven continued to open and close its sharp beak, but no sound came out. Very good, Miss Granger, said Professor Flitwick's squeaky little voice, making Harry, Ron and Hermione all jump. Now, let me see you try, Mr. Weasley. Right, said Ron, very flustered. Silencio. He jabbed at the bullfrog so hard he poked it in the eye. The frog gave a deafening croak and leapt off the desk. It came as no surprise to any of them that Harry and Ron were given additional practice of the silencing charm for homework. They were allowed to remain inside over break due to the downpour outside. They found seats in a noisy and overcrowded classroom on the first floor in which Peeves was floating dreamily up near the chandelier, occasionally blowing an ink pellet at the top of somebody's head. They had barely sat down when Angelina came struggling towards them through the groups of gossiping students. I've got permission, she said, to reform the Quidditch team. Excellent, said Ron and Harry together. Yeah, said Angelina, beaming. I went to McGonagall, and I think she might have appealed to Dumbledore. Anyway, Umbridge had to give in. Ha! So, I want you down at the pitch at 7 o'clock tonight, all right? Because we've got to make up time. You realise we're only 3 weeks away from our first match. She squeezed away from them, narrowly dodged an ink pellet from Peeves, which hit a nearby first year instead, and vanished from sight. Ron's smile slipped slightly as he looked out of the window, which was now opaque with hammering rain. Hope this clears up. What's up with you, Hermione? She too was gazing at the window, but not as though she really saw it. Her eyes were unfocused, and there was a frown on her face. Just thinking, she said, still frowning at the rain-washed window. About Snuffles, said Harry. No, not exactly, said Hermione slowly. More, wondering. I suppose we're doing the right thing. I think, aren't we? Harry and Ron looked at each other. Well, that clears that up, said Ron. It would have been really annoying if you hadn't explained yourself properly. Hermione looked at him as though she had only just realised he was there. I was just wondering, she said, her voice stronger now, whether we're doing the right thing, starting this defence against the Dark Arts group. What? Said Harry and Ron together. Hermione, it was your idea in the first place, said Ron indignantly. I know, said Hermione, twisting her fingers together, but after talking to Snuffles. But he's all right, said Harry. Yes, said Hermione, staring at the window again. Yes, that's what made me think maybe it wasn't a good idea after all. Peeves floated over them, on his stomach, pea shooter at the ready. Automatically, all three of them lifted their bags to cover their heads until he had passed. Let's get this straight, said Harry angrily, as they put their bags back on the floor. Sirius agrees with us, so you don't think we should do it any more? Hermione looked tense and rather miserable. Now staring at her own hands, she said, Do you honestly trust his judgment? Yes, I do, said Harry at once. He always gives us great advice. An ink pellet whizzed past them, striking Katie Bell squarely in the ear. Hermione watched Katie leap to her feet and start throwing things at Peeves. It was a few moments before Hermione spoke again, and it sounded as though she was choosing her words very carefully. You don't think he has become sort of reckless since he's been cooped up in Grimmauld Place? You don't think he's kind of living through us? What do you mean, living through us? Harry retorted. I mean, well, I think he'd love to be forming secret defence societies right under the nose of someone from the Ministry. I think he's really frustrated at how little he can do where he is. So I think he's keen to kind of egg us on. Ron looked utterly perplexed. Sirius is right, he said. You do sound just like my mother. Hermione bit her lip and did not answer. The bell rang just as Peeves swooped down on Katie and emptied an entire ink bottle over her head. The weather did not improve as the day wore on, so that at 7 o'clock that evening, when Harry and Ron went down to the Quidditch pitch for practice, they were soaked through within minutes, their feet slipping and sliding on the sodden grass. The sky was deep, thundery grey, and it was a relief to gain the warmth and the light of the changing rooms, even if they knew the respite was only temporary. They found Fred and George debating whether to use one of their own skiving snack boxes to get out of flying. But I bet she'd know what we'd done, Fred said out of the corner of his mouth. If only I hadn't offered to sell her some puking pastils yesterday. We could try the fever fudge, George muttered. No one's seen that yet. Does it work? Inquired Ron hopefully, as the hammering of rain on the roof intensified and wind howled around the building. Well, yeah, said Fred. Your temperature will go right up. But you get these massive pus-filled boils too, said George, and we haven't worked out how to get rid of them yet. I can't see any boils, said Ron, staring at the twins. No, well, you wouldn't, said Fred darkly. They're not in a place we generally display to the public. But they make sitting on a broom a right pain in the... All right, everyone, listen up, said Angelina loudly, emerging from the captain's office. I know it's not ideal weather, but there's a chance we'll be playing Slytherin in conditions like this, so it's a good idea to work out how we're going to cope with them. Harry, didn't you do something to your glasses to stop the rain fogging them up when we played Hufflepuff in that storm? Hermione did it, said Harry. He pulled out his wand, tapped his glasses and said, Impervious! I think we all ought to try that, said Angelina. If we could just keep the rain off our faces, it would really help visibility. All together. Come on. Impervious. OK, let's go. They all stowed their wands back in the inside pockets of their robes, shouldered their brooms, and followed Angelina out of the changing rooms. They squelched through the deepening mud to the middle of the pitch. Visibility was still very poor, even with the impervious charm. Light was fading fast, and curtains of rain were sweeping the grounds. All right, on my whistle, shouted Angelina. Harry kicked off from the ground, spraying mud in all directions, and shot upwards, the wind pulling him slightly off course. He had no idea how he was going to see the snitch in this weather. He was having enough difficulty seeing the one bludger with which they were practising. A minute into the practice, it almost unseated him, and he had to use the sloth grip roll to avoid it. Unfortunately, Angelina did not see this. In fact, she did not appear to be able to see anything. None of them had a clue what the others were doing. The wind was picking up. Even at a distance, Harry could hear the swishing, pounding sounds of the rain pummeling the surface of the lake. Angelina kept them at it for nearly an hour before conceding defeat. She led her sodden and disgruntled team back into the changing rooms, insisting that the practice had not been a waste of time, though without any real conviction in her voice. Fred and George were looking particularly annoyed. Both were bandy-legged and winced with every movement. Harry could hear them complaining in low voices as he towelled his hair dry. I think a few of mine have ruptured, said Fred in a hollow voice. Mine haven't, said George, wincing. They're throbbing like mad. Feel bigger, if anything. Ouch, said Harry. He pressed the towel to his face, his eyes screwed tight with pain. The scar on his forehead had seared again, more painfully than it had in weeks. What's up, said several voices. Harry emerged from behind his towel. The changing room was blurred because he was not wearing his glasses, but he could still tell that everyone's face was turned towards him. Nothing, he muttered. I poked myself in the eye, that's all. But he gave Ron a significant look, and the two of them hung back at the rest as the rest of the team filed back outside, muffled in their cloaks, their hats pulled low over their ears. What happened, said Ron, the moment Alicia had disappeared through the door. Was it your scar? Harry nodded. But, looking scared, Ron strode across to the window and stared out into the rain. He can't be near us now, can he? No, Harry muttered, sinking onto the bench and rubbing his forehead. He's probably miles away. It hurt because he's angry. Harry had not meant to say that at all, and heard the words as though a stranger had spoken them, yet knew at once that they were true. He did not know how he knew it, but he did. Voldemort, wherever he was, Whatever he was doing was in a towering temper. "Did you see him?" said Ron, looking horrified. "Did you get a vision or something?" Harry sat quite still, staring at his feet, allowing his mind and his memory to relax in the aftermath of the pain. A confused tangle of shapes, a howling rush of voices. "He wants something done, and it's not happening fast enough," he said. Again, he felt surprised to hear the words coming out of his mouth, and yet was quite certain they were true. "But how do you know?" said Ron. Harry shook his head and covered his eyes with his hands, pressing down upon them in his palms. Little stars erupted in them. He felt Ron sit down on the bench beside him, and knew Ron was staring at him. "Is this what it was about last time?" said Ron in a hushed voice. "When your scar hurt in Umbridge's office, you know who was angry." Harry shook his head. "What is it then?" Harry was thinking himself back. He had been looking into Umbridge's face. His scar had hurt. And he had had that odd feeling in his stomach, a strange leaping feeling, a happy feeling. But of course, he had not recognised it for what it was, as he had been feeling so miserable himself. Last time, it was because he was pleased, he said, really pleased. He thought something good was going to happen. And the night before we came back to Hogwarts, he thought back to the moment when his scar had hurt so badly in his and Ron's bedroom in Grimmauld Place. He was furious. He looked around at Ron, who was gaping at him. "You could take over from Trelawney, mate," he said in an awed voice. "I'm not making prophecies," said Harry. "No, you know what you're doing?" Ron said, sounding both scared and impressed. "Harry, you're reading You Know Whose mind." "No," said Harry, shaking his head. "It's more like his mood, I suppose. I'm just getting flashes of what mood he's in. Dumbledore said something like this was happening last year. He said that when Voldemort was near me, or when he was feeling hatred, I could tell. Well, now I'm feeling it when he's pleased, too." There was a pause, the wind and rain lashing at the building. "You've got to tell someone," said Ron. "I told Sirius last time." "Well, tell him about this time." "Can't, can I?" said Harry grimly. "Umbridge is watching the owls and the fires, remember?" "Well then, Dumbledore." "I've just told you, he already knows," said Harry shortly, getting to his feet and taking his cloak off his peg and swinging it around him. "There's no point telling him again." Ron did up the fastening of his own cloak, watching Harry thoughtfully. "Dumbledore'd want to know," he said. Harry shrugged. "Come on, we've still got silencing charms to practice." They hurried back through the dark grounds, sliding and stumbling on the muddy lawns, not talking. Harry was thinking hard. What was it that Voldemort wanted done that was not happening quickly enough? He's got other plans. Plans he can put into operation, very quietly indeed. Stuff he can only get by stealth. Like a weapon. Something he didn't have last time. Harry had not thought about those words in weeks. He had been too absorbed in what was going on at Hogwarts, too busy dwelling on the ongoing battles with Umbridge, the injustice of all the Ministry, interference. But now they came back to him, and made him wonder. Voldemort's anger could make sense if he was no nearer to laying hands on the weapon, whatever it was. Had the Order thwarted him? Stopped him from seizing it? What was it he kept? Where was it kept? Who had it now? "Mimbulus, Mimbletonia," said Ron's voice, and Harry came back to his senses just in time to clamber through the portrait hole into the common room. It appeared that Hermione had gone to bed early, leaving Crookshanks curled in a nearby chair and an assortment of knobbly knitted elf hats lying on a table by the fire. Harry was rather grateful that she was not around, because he did not much want to discuss his scar hurting and have her urge him to go to Dumbledore too. Ron kept throwing him anxious glances, but Harry pulled out his charms book and set to work on finishing his essay. Though he was only pretending to concentrate, and by the time Ron said he was going to bed too, he had written hardly anything. Midnight came and went while Harry was reading and rereading a passage about the uses of scurvy grass, lovage and sneezewort, and not taking in a word of it. "These plants are most efficacious in the inflaming of the brain, and are therefore much used in confusing and befuddlement draughts, where the wizard is desirous of producing hot-headedness and recklessness." Hermione said Sirius was becoming reckless, cooped up in Grimmauld Place. "Most efficacious in the inflaming of the brain, and are therefore much used." The Daily Prophet would think his brain was inflamed if they found out that he knew what Voldemort was feeling. "Therefore much used in confusing and befuddlement draughts." Confusing was the word, all right. Why did he know what Voldemort was feeling? What was this weird connection between them, which Dumbledore had never been able to explain satisfactorily? When the wizard is desirous, how Harry would like to sleep, of producing hot-headedness. It was warm and comfortable in his armchair before the fire, with the rain and still beating heavily on the window panes, Crookshanks purring and the crackling of the flames. The book slipped from Harry's slack grip and landed with a dull thud on the hearthrug. His head lolled sideways. He was walking once more along a windowless corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. As the door at the end of the passage loomed larger, his heart beat fast with excitement. If he could only open it, enter beyond. He stretched out his hand. His fingertips were inches from it. "Harry Potter, sir." He awoke with a start. The candles had all been extinguished in the common room, but there was something moving close by. "Who's there?" said Harry, sitting upright in his chair. The fire was almost out, the room very dark. "Dobby has your owl, sir," said a squeaky voice. "Dobby," said Harry thickly, peering through the gloom towards the source of the voice. Dobby the house elf was standing beside the table on which Hermione had left half a dozen of her knitted hats. His large pointed ears were now sticking out from beneath what looked like all the hats Hermione had ever knitted. He was wearing one on top of the other, so that his head seemed elongated by 2 or 3 feet, and on the very topmost bobble sat Hedwig, hooting serenely and obviously cured. "Dobby volunteered to return Harry Potter's owl," said the elf squeakily, with a look of positive adoration on his face. "Professor Grubbly Plank says she is all well now, sir." He sank into a deep bow so that his pencil-like nose brushed the threadbare surface of the hearthrug, and Hedwig gave an indignant hoot and fluttered onto the arm of Harry's chair. "Thanks, Dobby," said Harry, stroking Hedwig's head and blinking hard, trying to rid himself of the image of the door in his dream. It had been very vivid. Looking back at Dobby, he noticed that the elf was also wearing several scarves and innumerable socks, so that his feet looked far too big for his body. Have you been taking all the clothes Hermione's been leaving out?" "Oh, no, sir," said Dobby happily. "Dobby has been taking some for Winky too, sir." "Yeah, how is Winky?" asked Harry. Dobby's ears drooped slightly. "Winky is still drinking lots, sir," he said sadly, his enormous round green eyes, large as tennis balls, downcast. "She still does not care for clothes, Harry Potter, nor do the other house elves. None of them will clean Gryffindor Tower any more, not with the hats and socks hidden everywhere. They finds them insulting, sir. Dobby does it all himself, sir, but Dobby does not mind, sir, for he always hopes to meet Harry Potter, and tonight, sir, he has got his wish." Dobby sank into a deep bow again. "But Harry Potter does not seem happy." Dobby went on, straightening up again, and looking timidly at Harry. "Dobby heard him muttering in his sleep. Was Harry Potter having bad dreams?" "Not really bad," said Harry, yawning and rubbing his eyes. "I've had worse." The elf surveyed Harry out of his vast orb-like eyes. Then he said very seriously, his ears drooping, "Dobby wishes he could help Harry Potter, for Harry Potter set Dobby free, and Dobby is much, much happier now." Harry smiled. "You can't help me, Dobby, but thanks for the offer." He bent and picked up his potions book. He'd have to try to finish the essay tomorrow. He closed the book, and as he did so, the firelight illuminated the thin white scars on the back of his hand, the result of his detentions with Umbridge. "Wait a moment. There is something you can do for me, Dobby," said Harry slowly. The elf looked around, beaming. "Name it, Harry Potter, sir." "I need to find a place where 28 people can practice defence against the dark arts without being discovered by any of the teachers, especially—" Harry clenched his hand onto the book, so that the scars shone pearly white. "Professor Umbridge." He expected the elf's smile to vanish, his ears to droop. He expected him to say it was impossible, or else that he would try to find somewhere, but his hopes were not high. What he had not expected was for Dobby to give a little skip, his ears waggling cheerfully, and clap his hands together. "Dobby knows the perfect place, sir," he said happily. "Dobby heard tell of it from the other house elves when he came to Hogwarts, sir. It is known by us as the come-and-go room, sir, or else as the room of requirement." "Why?" said Harry curiously. "Because it is a room that a person can only enter," said Dobby seriously, "when they have a real need for it. Sometimes it is there, and sometimes it is not, but when it appears, it is always equipped for the seeker's needs. Dobby has used it, sir," said the elf, dropping his voice and looking guilty, "when Winky has been very drunk. He has hidden her in the room of requirement, and he has found antidotes to butterbeer there, and a nice elf-sized bed to settle her on while she sleeps it off, sir. And Dobby knows Mr. Filch has found some extra cleaning materials there when he has run short, sir, and if you really needed a bathroom," said Harry, suddenly remembering something Dumbledore had said at the Yule Ball the previous Christmas, "would it fill itself with chamber pots?" "Dobby expects so, sir," said Dobby, nodding earnestly. "It is a most amazing room, sir." "How many people know about it?" said Harry, sitting up straighter in his chair.
Very few, sir. Mostly people stumbles across it when they needs it, sir, but often they never finds it again, for they do not know that it is always there, waiting to be called into service, sir." "It sounds brilliant," said Harry, his heart racing. "It sounds perfect, Dobby. When can you show me where it is?" "Any time, Harry Potter, sir," said Dobby, looking delighted at Harry's enthusiasm. "We could go now if you like." For a moment Harry was tempted to go with Dobby. He was halfway out of his seat, intending to hurry upstairs for his invisibility cloak, when, not for the first time, a voice, very much like Hermione's, whispered in his ear, "Reckless." It was, after all, very late, and he was exhausted. "Not tonight, Dobby," said Harry reluctantly, sinking back into his chair. "This is really important. I don't want to blow it. It'll need proper planning. Listen, can you just tell me exactly where this room of requirement is, and how you get in there?" Their robes billowed and swirled around them as they splashed across the flooded vegetable patch to double herbology, where they could hardly hear what Professor Sprout was saying over the hammering of raindrops hard as hailstones on the greenhouse roof. The afternoon's Care of Magical Creatures lesson was to be relocated from the storm-swept grounds to a free classroom on the ground floor. To their intense relief, Angelina had sought out her team at lunch to tell them that Quidditch practice was cancelled. "Good," said Harry quietly when he told them, "because we found somewhere to have our first defence meeting. Tonight, 8 o'clock, 7th floor, opposite that tapestry of Barnabas, the barmy being clubbed by those trolls. Can you tell Katie and Alicia?" She looked slightly taken aback, but promised to tell the others. Harry returned hungrily to his sausages and mash. When he looked up to take a drink of pumpkin juice, he found Hermione watching him. "What?" he said thickly. "Well, it's just that Dobby's plans aren't always that safe. Don't you remember when he lost you all the bones in your arm? This room isn't just some mad idea of Dobby's. Dumbledore knows about it too. He mentioned it to me at the Yule Ball." Hermione's expression cleared. "Dumbledore told you about it?" "Just in passing," said Harry, shrugging. "Oh, well, that's all right then," said Hermione briskly, and raised no more objections. Together with Ron, they had spent most of the day seeking out those people who had signed their names to the list in the Hog's Head and telling them where to meet that evening. Somewhat to Harry's disappointment, it was Ginny who managed to find Cho Chang and her friend first. However, by the end of dinner, he was confident that the news had been passed to every one of the 25 people who had turned up in the Hog's Head. At 7:30, Harry, Ron and Hermione left the Gryffindor common room, Harry clutching the certain piece of aged parchment in his hand. Fifth years were allowed to be out of the corridors until 9 o'clock, but all three of them kept looking around nervously as they made their way along the 7th floor. "Hold it," Harry warned, unfolding the piece of parchment at the top of the last staircase, tapping it with his wand and muttering, "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." A map of Hogwarts appeared on the blank surface of the parchment. Tiny black moving dots, labelled with names, showed where various people were. "Filch is on the 2nd floor," said Harry, holding the map close to his eyes, "and Mrs. Norris is on the 4th. "And Umbridge?" said Hermione anxiously. "In her office," said Harry, pointing. "OK, let's go." They hurried along the corridor to the place Dobby had described to Harry, a stretch of blank wall opposite an enormous tapestry depicting Barnabas the Barmy's foolish attempt to train trolls for the ballet. "OK," said Harry quietly, while a moth-eaten troll paused in his relentless clubbing of the would-be ballet teacher to watch them. Dobby said to walk past this bit of the wall 3 times, concentrating hard on what we need. They did so, turning sharply at the window just beyond the blank stretch of wall, then at the mound-sized vase on its other side. Ron had screwed up his eyes in concentration. Hermione was whispering something under her breath. Harry's fists were clenched as he stared ahead of him. "We need somewhere to learn to fight," he thought. "Just give us a place to practice, somewhere they can't find us." "Harry," said Hermione sharply, as they wheeled around after their third walk past. A highly polished door had appeared in the wall. Ron was staring at it, looking slightly wary. Harry reached out, seized the brass handle, pulled open the door, and led the way into a spacious room lit with flickering torches like those that illuminated the dungeons 8 floors below. The walls were lined with wooden bookcases, and instead of chairs, there were large silk cushions on the floor. A set of shelves at the far end of the room carried a range of instruments such as sneakoscopes, secrecy sensors, and a large, cracked faux glass that Harry was sure had hung the previous year in the fake Moody's office. "These will be good when we're practicing stunning," said Ron enthusiastically, prodding one of the cushions with his foot. "And just look at these books," said Hermione excitedly, running a finger along the spines of the large leather-bound tomes. "A compendium of common curses and their counteractions, the dark arts, outsmarked. Self-defensive spell work. Wow! She looked around at Harry, her face glowing, and he saw that the presence of hundreds of books had finally convinced Hermione that what they were doing was right. Harry, this is wonderful. There's everything we need here. And without further ado, she slid Jinxes for the Jinxed from its shelf, sank onto the nearest cushion, and began to read. There was a gentle knock on the door. Harry looked around. Ginny, Neville, Lavender, Pavati, and Dean had arrived. "Whoa," said Dean, staring around impressed. "What is this place?" Harry began to explain, but before he had finished, more people had arrived, and he had to start all over again. By the time 8 o'clock arrived, every cushion was occupied. Harry moved across to the door and turned the key protruding from the lock. It clicked in a satisfyingly loud way, and everybody fell silent, looking at him. Hermione carefully marked her page of Jinxes for the Jinxed and set the book aside. "Well," said Harry, slightly nervously, "this is the place we found for practice sessions, and you've obviously found it okay." "It's fantastic," said Cho, and several people murmured their agreement. "It's bizarre," said Fred, frowning around at it. "We once hid from Filch in here, remember, George? But it was just a broom cupboard then." "Hey, Harry, what's this stuff?" asked Dean from the rear of the room, indicating the sneaker scopes and the faux glass. "Dark detectors," said Harry, stepping between the cushions to reach them. "Basically, they all show when dark wizards or enemies are around, but you don't want to rely on them too much. They can be fooled." He gazed for a moment into the cracked faux glass. Shadowy figures were moving around inside it, though none was recognisable. He turned his back on it. "Well, I've been thinking about the sort of stuff we ought to do first, and, he noticed a raised hand. "What, Hermione?" "I think we ought to elect a leader," said Hermione. "Harry's leader," said Cho at once, looking at Hermione as though she were mad. Harry's stomach did yet another backflip. "Yes, but I think we ought to vote on it properly," said Hermione, unperturbed. "It makes it formal and gives him authority, so everyone who thinks Harry ought to be the leader." Everybody put up their hand, even Zacharias Smith, though he did it very half-heartedly. Right, thanks," said Harry, who could feel his face burning. "And what, Hermione?" "I also think we ought to have a name," she said brightly, her hand still in the air. "It would promote a feeling of team spirit and unity, don't you think?" "Can we be the Anti-Umbridge League?" said Angelina hopefully. "Or the Ministry of Magic are Morons group," suggested Fred. "I was thinking," said Hermione, frowning at Fred, "more of a name that didn't tell everyone that what we were up to, so we can refer to it safely outside meetings." "The Defence Association?" said Cho. "The DA for short, so nobody knows what we're talking about." "Yeah, the DA's good," said Ginny. "Only, let's make it stand for Dumbledore's Army, because that's the Ministry's worst fear, isn't it?" There was a good deal of appreciative murmuring and laughter at this. "All in favour of the DA," said Hermione bossily, kneeling up on her cushion to count. "That's a majority. Motion passed." She pinned the piece of parchment, with all their signatures on it, onto the wall and wrote across the top in large letters, "Dumbledore's Army." "Right," said Harry, when she had sat down again. "Shall we get practising then? I was thinking the first thing we should do is Expelliarmus. You know, the disarming charm. I know it's pretty basic, but I found it really useful." "Oh, please," said Zacharias Smith, rolling his eyes and folding his arms. "I don't think Expelliarmus is exactly going to help us against you-know-who, do you?" "I've used it against him," said Harry quietly. "It saved my life in June." Smith opened his mouth, stupidly. The rest of the room was very quiet. "But if you think it's beneath you, you can leave," Harry said. Smith did not move, nor did anybody else. "OK," said Harry, his mouth slightly drier than usual with all these eyes upon him. "I reckon we should all divide into pairs and practice." It felt very odd to be issuing instructions, but not nearly as odd as seeing them followed. Everybody got to their feet at once and divided up. Predictably, Neville was left partnerless. "You can practice with me," Harry told him. "Right, on the count of 3 then. 1, 2, 3. The room was suddenly full of shouts of "Expelliarmus!" Wands flew in all directions, missed spells, hit books on shelves, and sent them flying into the air. Harry was too quick for Neville, whose wand went spinning out of his hand, hit the ceiling in a shower of sparks, and landed with a clatter on top of a bookshelf, from which Harry retrieved it with a summoning charm. Glancing around, he thought he had been right to suggest they practice the basics first. There was a lot of shoddy spell work going on. Many people were not succeeding in disarming their opponents at all, but merely causing them to jump backwards a few paces or wince as their feeble spell whooshed over them. "Expelliarmus," said Neville, and Harry, caught unawares, felt his wand fly out of his hand. "I did it," said Neville gleefully. "I've done it before, but I did it." "Good one," said Harry encouragingly, deciding not to point out that in a real duel, Neville's opponent was unlikely to be staring in the opposite direction with his wand held loosely at his side. Listen, Neville, can you take it in turns to practice with Ron and Hermione for a couple of minutes, so I can walk around and see how the rest are doing? Harry moved off into the middle of the room. Something very odd was happening to Zacharias Smith. Every time he opened his mouth to disarm Anthony Goldstein, his own wand would fly out of his hand. Yet Anthony did not seem to be making a sound. Harry did not have to look far to solve the mystery. Fred and George were several feet from Smith and taking it in turns to point their wands at his back. "Sorry, Harry," said George hastily, when Harry caught his eye. "Couldn't resist." Harry walked around the other pairs, trying to correct those who were doing the spell wrong. Ginny was teamed with Michael Corner. She was doing very well, whereas Michael was either very bad or unwilling to jinx her. Ernie Macmillan was flourishing his wand unnecessarily, giving his partner time to get in under his guard. The Creevy brothers were enthusiastic but erratic, and mainly responsible for all the books leaping off the shelves around them. Luna Lovegood was similarly patchy, occasionally sending Justin Finch Fletchley's wand spinning out of his hand, at other times merely causing his hair to stand on end. "Okay, stop," Harry shouted. "Stop, stop!" "I need a whistle," he thought, and immediately spotted one lying on top of the nearest row of books. He caught it up and blew hard. Everyone lowered their wands. "That wasn't bad," said Harry, "but there's definite room for improvement." Zacharias Smith glared at him. "Let's try again." He moved off around the room again, stopping here and there to make suggestions. Slowly, the general performance improved. He avoided going near Cho and her friend for a while, but after walking twice around every other pair in the room, he felt he could not ignore them any longer. "Oh no," said Cho rather wildly as he approached. Expelliarmus! Oh, sorry, Marietta." Her curly-haired friend's sleeve had caught fire. Marietta extinguished it with her own wand and glanced at Harry as though it was his fault. "You made me nervous. I was doing all right before then," Cho told Harry ruefully. "That was quite good," Harry lied. But when she raised her eyebrows, he said, "Well, no, it was lousy, but I know you can do it properly. I was watching from over there." She laughed. Her friend Marietta looked at them rather sourly and turned away. "Don't mind her," Cho muttered. "She doesn't really want to be here, but I made her come with me. Her parents have forbidden her to do anything that might upset Umbridge. You see, her mum works for the ministry." "What about your parents?" asked Harry. "Well, they've forbidden me to get on the wrong side of Umbridge too," said Cho, drawing herself up proudly. "But if they think I'm going to fight you-know-who after what happened to Cedric—" She broke off, looking rather confused, and an awkward silence fell between them. Terry Boots' wand went whizzing past Harry's ear and hit Alicia Spinnet hard on the nose. "Well, my dad is very supportive of any anti-ministry action," said Luna Lovegood, proudly from just behind Harry. Evidently she had been eavesdropping on his conversation, while Justin Finch Fletchley appeared to disentangle himself from the robes that had flown up over his head. "He's always saying he'd believe anything of Fudge. I mean, the number of goblins Fudge has had assassinated. And of course, he uses the Department of Mysteries to develop terrible poisons, which he secretly feeds to anybody who disagrees with him. And then there's his, gumbular slash-kilter." "Don't ask," Harry muttered to Cho as she opened her mouth, looking puzzled. She giggled. "Hey, Harry," Hermione called from the other end of the room. "Have you checked the time?" He looked down at his watch and was shocked to see it was already 9:10, which meant they needed to get back to the common rooms immediately or risk being caught and punished by Filch for being out of bounds. He blew his whistle. Everybody stopped shouting Expelliarmus, and the last couple of wands clattered to the floor. "Well, that was pretty good," said Harry, "but we've overrun. We'd better leave it here. Same time, same place next week." "Sooner," said Dean Thomas eagerly, and many people nodded in agreement. Angelina, however, said quickly, "The Quidditch season's about to start. We need team practices too." "Let's say next Wednesday night then," said Harry. "We can decide on additional meetings then. Come on, we'd better get going." He pulled out the Marauders map again and checked it carefully for signs of teachers on the 7th floor. He let them all leave in 3s and 4s, watching their tiny dots anxiously to see that they returned safely to their dormitories. The Hufflepuffs in the basement corridor that also led to the kitchens, the Ravenclaws to a tower on the west side of the castle, and the Gryffindors along the corridor to the fat lady's portrait. "That was really, really good, Harry," said Hermione, when finally it was just her, Harry and Ron who were left. "Yeah, it was," said Ron enthusiastically, as they slipped out of the door and watched it melt back into stone behind them. "Did you see me disarm Hermione, Harry?" "Only once," said Hermione, stung. "I got you loads more than you got me." I did not only get you once, I got you at least 3 times. Well, if you're counting the one where you tripped over your own feet and knocked the wand out of my hand." They argued all the way back to the common room, but Harry was not listening to them.
He had one eye on the Marauders map, but he was also thinking of Cho, saying he made her nervous. Chapter 19. The Lion and the Serpent. Harry felt as though he were carrying some kind of talisman inside his chest over the following 2 weeks, a glowing secret that supported him through Umbridge's classes and even made it possible for him to smile blandly as he looked into her horrible bulging eyes. He and the DA were resisting her under her very nose, doing the very thing she and the Ministry most feared, and whenever he was supposed to be reading Wilbert Slinkhard's book during the lessons, he dwelled instead on satisfying memories of their most recent meetings, remembering how Neville had successfully disarmed Hermione, how Colin Creevey had mastered the impediment jinx after 3 meetings' hard effort, how Parvati Patil had produced such a good reductor curse that she had reduced the table carrying all the sneakerscopes to dust. He was finding it almost impossible to fix a regular night of the week for the DA meetings, as they had to accommodate 3 separate teams' Quidditch practices, which were often rearranged due to bad weather conditions, but Harry was not sorry about this. He had a feeling that it was probably better to keep the timing of their meetings unpredictable. If anyone was watching them, it would be hard to make out a pattern. Hermione soon devised a very clever method of communicating the time and date of the next meeting to all the members in case they needed to change it at short notice, because it would look suspicious if people from different houses were seen crossing the Great Hall to talk to each other too often. She gave each of the members of the DA a fake galleon. Ron became very excited when he first saw the basket and was convinced she was actually giving out gold. "You see the numerals around the edge of the coins," Hermione said, holding one up for examination at the end of their 4th meeting. The coin gleamed fat and yellow in the light from the torches. On real galleons, that's just a serial number referring to the goblin who cast the coin. On these fake coins, though, the numbers will change to reflect the time and date of the next meeting. The coins will grow hot when the date changes, so if you're carrying them in a pocket, you'll be able to feel them. We take each one, and when Harry sets the date of the next meeting, he'll change the numbers on his coin, and because I've put a protean charm on them, they'll all change to mimic his. A blank silence greeted Hermione's words. She looked around at all the faces upturned to her, rather disconcerted. "Well, I thought it was a good idea," she said uncertainly. "I mean, even if Umbridge asked us to turn out our pockets, there's nothing fishy about carrying a galleon, is there? But, well, if you don't want to use them—" "You can do a protean charm," said Terry Boot. "Yes," said Hermione. "But that's Newt's standard, that is," he said weakly. "Oh," said Hermione, trying to look modest. "Oh, well, yes, I suppose it is." "How come you're not in Ravenclaw?" he demanded, staring at Hermione with something close to wonder, "with brains like yours?" "Well, the Sorting Hat did seriously consider putting me in Ravenclaw during my sorting," said Hermione brightly, "but it decided on Gryffindor in the end. So, does that mean we're using the galleons?" There was a murmur of assent, and everybody moved forwards to collect one from the basket. Harry looked sideways at Hermione. "You know what these remind me of?" "No, what's that?" "The Death Eater's scars. Voldemort touches one of them, and all their scars burn, and they know they've got to join him." "Well, yes," said Hermione quietly. "That is where I got the idea. But you'll notice I decided to engrave the date on bits of metal rather than on our members' skin." "Yeah, I prefer your way," said Harry, grinning, as he slipped his galleon into his pocket. "I suppose the only danger with these is that we might accidentally spend them." "Fat chance," said Ron, who was examining his own fake galleon with a slightly mournful air. "Haven't got any real galleons to confuse it with." As the first Quidditch match of the season, Gryffindor versus Slytherin, drew nearer, their DA meetings were put on hold because Angelina insisted on almost daily practices. The fact that the Quidditch Cup had not been held for so long added considerably to the interest and excitement surrounding the forthcoming game. The Ravenclaws and Hufflepuffs were taking a lively interest in the outcome, for they, of course, will be playing both teams over the coming year, and the heads of house of the competing teams, though they attempted to disguise it under a decent pretense of sportsmanship, were determined to see their own side victorious. Harry realised how much Professor McGonagall cared about beating Slytherin when she abstained from giving them homework in the week leading up to the match. "I think you've got enough to be getting on with at the moment," she said loftily. Nobody could quite believe their ears until she looked directly at Harry and Ron and said grimly, "I've become accustomed to seeing the Quidditch Cup in my study, boys, and I really don't want to have to hand it over to Professor Snape, so use the extra time to practice, won't you?" Snape was no less obviously partisan. He had booked the Quidditch pitch for Slytherin practice so often that the Gryffindors had difficulty getting on to play. He was also turning a deaf ear to the many reports of Slytherin attempts to hex Gryffindor players in the corridors.
When Alicia Spinnet turned up at the hospital wing with her eyebrows growing so thick and fast they obscured her vision and obstructed her mouth, Snape insisted that she must have attempted a hair-thickening charm on herself and refused to listen to the 14 eyewitnesses who insisted they had seen the Slytherin keeper, Miles Bletchley, hit her from behind with a jinx while she worked in the library. Harry felt optimistic about Gryffindor's chances. They had, after all, never lost to Malfoy's team. Admittedly, Ron was still not performing to Wood's standard, but he was also extremely hard to improve. His greatest weakness was a tendency to lose confidence after he'd made a blunder. If he let in one goal, he became flustered, and was therefore likely to miss more. On the other hand, Harry had seen Ron make some truly spectacular saves when he was on form. During one memorable practice, he had hung one-handed from his broom and kicked the quaffle so hard away from the goal hoop that it soared the length of the pitch and through the centre hoop at the other end. The rest of the team felt the save compared favourably with one made recently by Barry Ryan, the Irish international keeper, almost against Poland's top chaser, Ladislaw Zamoszki. Even Fred had said that Ron might yet make him and George proud, and they were seriously considering admitting he was related to them, something they assured him they had been trying to deny for 4 years. The only thing really worrying Harry was how much Ron was allowing the tactics of the Slytherin team to upset him before they even got onto the pitch. Harry, of course, had endured their snide comments for over 4 years, so whispers of, "Hey, Potty, I heard Warrington's sworn to knock you off your broom on Saturday," far from chilling his blood, made him laugh. "Warrington's aim so pathetic I'd be more worried if he was aiming for the person next to me," he retorted, which made Ron and Hermione laugh and wiped the smirk off Pansy Parkinson's face. But Ron had never endured a relentless campaign of insults, jeers and intimidation. When Slytherins, some of them 7th years, and considerably larger than he was, muttered as they passed in the corridors, "Got your bed booked in the hospital wing, Weasley." He didn't laugh, but turned a delicate shade of green. When Draco Malfoy imitated Ron dropping the quaffle, which he did whenever they came within sight of each other, Ron's ears glowed red and his hands shook so badly that he was likely to drop whatever he was holding at the time, too. October extinguished itself in a rush of howling winds and driving rain, and November arrived, cold as frozen iron, with hard frosts every morning and icy draughts that bit as it had exposed hands and faces. The skies and the ceiling of the Great Hall turned pale, pearly grey, the mountains around Hogwarts were snow-capped, and the temperature in the castle dropped so low that many students wore their dark, thick, protective dragon-skin gloves in the corridors between lessons. The morning of the match dawned bright and cold. When Harry awoke, he looked around at Ron's bed and saw him sitting bolt upright, his arms around his knees, staring fixedly into space. "You're right," said Harry. Ron nodded but did not speak. Harry was reminded forcibly of the time Ron had accidentally put a slug-vomiting charm on himself. He looked just as pale and sweaty as he had done then, not to mention as reluctant to open his mouth. "You just need some breakfast," Harry said bracingly. "Come on." The Great Hall was filling up fast when they arrived, the talk louder and the mood more exuberant than usual. As they passed the Slytherin table, there was an upsurge of noise. Harry looked around and saw that in addition to the usual green and silver scarves and hats, every one of them was wearing a silver badge in the shape of what seemed to be a crown. For some reason, many of them waved at Ron, laughing uproariously. Harry tried to see what was written on the badges as he walked by, but he was too concerned to get Ron past their table quickly to linger long enough to read them. They reached a rousing welcome at the Gryffindor table, where everyone was wearing red and gold, but far from raising Ron's spirits, the cheers seemed to sap the last of his morale. He collapsed onto the nearest bench, looking as though he was facing his final meal. "I must have been mental to do this," he said in a croaky whisper. "Mental!" "Don't be thick," said Harry firmly, passing him a choice of cereals. "You're going to be fine. It's normal to be nervous." "I'm rubbish," croaked Ron. "I'm lousy. I can't play to save my life. What was I thinking?" "Get a grip," said Harry sternly. "Look at that save you made with your foot the other day. Even Fred and George said it was brilliant." Ron turned a tortured face to Harry. "That was an accident," he whispered miserably. "I didn't mean to do it. I slipped off my broom when none of you were looking, and when I was trying to get back on, I kicked the quaffle by accident." "Well," said Harry, recovering quickly from his unpleasant surprise, "a few more accidents like that and the game's in the bag, isn't it?" Hermione and Ginny sat down opposite them wearing red and gold scarves, gloves and rosettes. "How are you feeling?" Ginny asked Ron, who was now staring into the dregs of milk at the bottom of his empty cereal bowl, as though seriously considering attempting to drown himself in them. "He's just nervous," said Harry. "Well, that's a good sign. I never feel you perform as well in exams if you're not a bit nervous," said Hermione heartily. "Hello," said a vague and dreamy voice from behind them. Harry looked up. Luna Lovegood had drifted over from the Ravenclaw table. Many people were staring at her, and a few were openly laughing and pointing. She had managed to procure a hat shaped like a life-size lion's head, which was perched precariously on her head. "I'm supporting Gryffindor," said Luna, pointing unnecessarily at her hat. "Look what it does." She reached up and tapped the hat with her wand. It opened its mouth wide and gave an extremely realistic roar that made everyone in the vicinity jump. "It's good, isn't it?" said Lorna happily. "I wanted to have it chewing up a serpent to represent Slytherin, you know, but there wasn't time. Anyway, good luck, Ronald." She drifted away. They had not quite recovered from the shock of Luna's hat before Angelina came hurrying towards them, accompanied by Katie and Alicia, whose eyebrows had mercifully been returned to normal by Madame Pomfrey. "When you're ready," she said, "we're going to go straight down to the pitch, check out conditions and change." "We'll be there in a bit," Harry assured her. "Ron's just got to have some breakfast." It became clear after 10 minutes, however, that Ron was not capable of eating anything more, and Harry thought it best to get him down to the changing rooms. As they rose from the table, Hermione got up too, and taking Harry's arm, she drew him to one side. "Don't let Ron see what's on those Slytherin badges," she whispered urgently. Harry looked questioningly at her, but she shook her head warningly. Ron had just ambled over to them, looking lost and desperate. "Good luck, Ron," said Hermione, standing on tiptoe and kissing him on the cheek. "And you, Harry." Ron seemed to come to himself slightly as they walked back across the great hall. He touched the spot on his face where Hermione had kissed him, looked puzzled, as though he was not quite sure what had just happened. He seemed too distracted to notice much around him, but Harry cast a curious glance at the crown-shaped badges as they passed the Slytherin table, and this time he made out the words etched onto them. "Weasley is our king." With an unpleasant feeling that this could mean nothing good, he hurried Ron across the entrance hall, down the stone steps, and out into the icy air. The frosty grass crunched under their feet as they hurried down the sloping lawns towards the stadium. There was no wind at all, and the sky was a uniform pearly white, which meant that visibility would be good without the drawback of direct sunlight in the eyes. Harry pointed out these encouraging factors to Ron as they walked, but he was not sure that Ron was listening. Angelina had changed already and was talking to the rest of the team when they entered. Harry and Ron pulled on their robes. Ron attempted to do his up back to front for several minutes before Alicia took pity on him and went to help, then sat down to listen to the pre-match talk while the babble of voices outside grew steadily louder as the crowd came pouring out of the castle towards the pitch. "OK, I've only just found out the final lineup for Slytherin," said Angelina, consulting a piece of parchment. "Last year's beaters, Derek and Boll, have left, but it looks as though Montague's replaced them with the usual gorillas, rather than anyone who can fly particularly well. They're two blokes called Crabbe and Goyle. I don't know much about them." "We do," said Harry and Ron together. "Well, they don't look bright enough to tell one end of a broom from the other," said Angelina, pocketing her parchment. "But then I was always surprised Derek and Boll managed to find their way onto the pitch without signposts." "Crabbe and Goyle are in the same mould," Harry assured her. They could hear hundreds of footsteps mounting the banked benches of the spectators' stands. Some people were singing, though Harry could not make out the words. He was starting to feel nervous, but he knew his butterflies were as nothing compared to Ron's. He was clutching his stomach and staring straight ahead again, his jaw set and his complexion pale grey. "It's time," said Angelina in a hushed voice, looking at her watch. "Come on, everyone. Good luck." The team rose, shouldered their brooms and marched in single file out of the changing room and into the dazzling sky. A roar of sound greeted them, in which Harry could still hear singing, though it was muffled by the cheers and whistles. The Slytherin team was standing waiting for them. They too were wearing those silver crown-shaped badges. The new captain, Montague, was built along the same lines as Dudley Dursley, with massive forearms like hairy hams. Behind him lurked Crabbe and Goyle, almost as large, blinking stupidly, swinging their new beaters' bats. Malfoy stood to one side, the sunlight gleaming on his white blonde head. He caught Harry's eye and smirked, tapping the crown-shaped badge on his chest. "Captains, shake hands," ordered the referee, Madame Hooch, as Angelina and Montague reached out to each other. Harry could tell that Montague was trying to crush Angelina's fingers, though she did not wince. "Mount your brooms!" Madame Hooch placed her whistle in her mouth and blew. The balls were released and the 14 players shot upwards. Out of the corner of his eye, Harry saw Ron streak off towards the goal hoops. Harry zoomed higher, dodging a bludger, and set off on a wide lap of the pitch, gazing around for a glint of gold. On the other side of the stadium, Draco Malfoy was doing exactly the same. "And it's Johnson! Johnson with the quaffle! What a player that girl is! I've been saying it for years, but she still won't go out with me." "Jordan!" yelled Professor McGonagall. Just a fun fact, Professor. Adds a bit of interest. And she's ducked Warrington. She's past Montague. She's, ouch, being hit from behind by a bludger from Crabbe. Montague catches the quaffle. Montague heading back up to the pitch, and nice bludger there from George Weasley. That's a bludger to the head for Montague. He drops the quaffle. Caught by Katie Bell. Katie Bell for Gryffindor. Reverse passes to Alicia Spinnet, and Spinnet's away. Lee Jordan's commentary rang through the stadium, and Harry listened as hard as he could through the wind whistling in his ears and the din of the crowd, all yelling and booing and singing. Dodges Warrington, avoids a bludger, close call, Alicia, and the crowd are loving this. Just listen to them. What's that they're singing? And as Lee paused to listen, the song rose loud and clear from the sea of green and silver in the Slytherin section of the stands. Weasley cannot save a thing, he cannot block a single ring, that's why Slytherin all sing, Weasley is our king. Weasley was born in a bin, he always lets the quaffle in, Weasley will make sure we win, Weasley is our king. And Alicia passes back to Angelina, Lee shouted, and as Harry swerved, his insides boiling at what he had just heard, he knew Lee was trying to drown out the words of the song. Come on now, Angelina, looks like she's got just the keeper to beat. She shoots! Bletchley, the Slytherin keeper, had saved the goal. He threw the quaffle to Warrington, who sped off with it, zigzagging in between Alicia and Katie. The singing from below grew louder and louder as he drew nearer and nearer Ron. Weasley is our king! Weasley is our king! He always lets the quaffle in! Weasley is our king! Harry could not help himself. Abandoning his search for the snitch, he turned his firebolt towards Ron, a lone figure at the far end of the pitch, hovering before the 3 goal hoops while the massive Warrington pelted towards him. And it's Warrington with the quaffle. Warrington heading for goal. He's out of bludger range, with just the keeper ahead. A great swell of song rose from the Slytherin stands below. Weasley cannot save a thing, he cannot block a single ring. So, it's the first test for new Gryffindor keeper Weasley, brother of beaters Fred and George, and a promising new talent on the team. Come on, Ron! But the scream of delight came from the Slytherin's end. Ron had dived wildly, his arms wide, and the quaffle had soared between them straight through Ron's central hoop. Slytherin score! Came Lee's voice, amid the cheering and booing from the crowds below. So that's 10-0 to Slytherin. Bad luck, Ron. The Slytherin sang even louder. Weasley was born in a bin, he always let the quaffle in. And Gryffindor back in possession, and it's Katie Bell tanking up the pitch, cried Lee valiantly, though the singing was now so deafening that he could hardly make himself heard above it. Weasley will make sure we win. Weasley is our king. Harry, what are you doing? Screamed Angelina, soaring past him to keep up with Katie. Get going! Harry realised he'd been stationary in mid-air for over a minute, watching the progress of the match without sparing a thought for the whereabouts of the snitch. Horrified, he went into a dive and started circling the pitch again, staring around, trying to ignore the chorus now thundering through the stadium. Weasley is our king! Weasley is our king! There was no sign of the snitch anywhere he looked. Malfoy was still circling the stadium just as he was. They passed one another midway around the pitch, going in opposite directions, and Harry heard Malfoy singing loudly, Weasley was born in a bin. And it's Warrington again, bellowed Lee, who passes to Pusey. Pusey's off past Spinnet. Come on now, Angelina, you can take him. Turns out you can't, but nice bludger from George Weasley. Oh, who cares, one of them. Anyway, and Warrington drops the quaffle, and Katie Bell, drops it too, so that's Montague with the quaffle. Slytherin Captain Montague takes the quaffle, and he's off up the pitch. Come on now, Gryffindor, block him! Harry zoomed around the end of the stadium, behind the Slytherin goal hoops, willing himself not to look at what was going on at Ron's end. As he sped past the Slytherin keeper, he heard Bletchley singing along with the crowd below. Weasley cannot save a thing. And Pusey's dodged Alicia again, and he's heading straight for goal. Stop it, Ron! Harry did not have to look to see what had happened. There was a terrible groan from the Gryffindor end, coupled with fresh screams and applause from the Slytherins. Looking down, Harry saw the pug-faced Pansy Parkinson right at the front of the stands, her back to the pitch, as she conducted the Slytherin supporters who were roaring, That's why Slytherins all sing, Weasley is our king. But 20-0 was nothing. There was still time for Gryffindor to catch up, or catch the snitch. A few goals, and they could be in the lead, as usual. Harry assured himself, bobbing and weaving through other players in pursuit of something shiny that turned out to be Montague's watch strap. But Ron let in 2 more goals. There was an edge of panic in Harry's desire to find the snitch now, if he could just get it soon and finish the game quickly. And Katie Bell of Gryffindor dodges Pusey, ducks Montague. Nice swerve, Katie. And she throws to Johnson. Angelina Johnson takes the quaffle. She's past Warrington. She's heading for goal. Come on now, Angelina. Gryffindor score! It's 40-10. 40-10 to Slytherin. And Pusey has the quaffle. Harry could hear Luna's ludicrous lion hat roaring amidst the Gryffindor cheers and felt heartened. Only 30 points in it. That was nothing. They could pull back easily. Harry ducked a bludger that Crabbe had sent rocketing in his direction and resumed his frantic scouring of the pitch for the snitch, keeping one eye on Malfoy in case he showed signs of having spotting it. But Malfoy, like him, was continuing to soar around the stadium, searching fruitlessly. Pusey throws to Warrington. Warrington to Montague. Montague back to Pusey. Johnson intervenes. Johnson takes the quaffle. Johnson to Bell. This looks good. I mean bad. Bell's hit by a bludger from Goyle of Slytherin, and it's Pusey in possession again. Weasley was born in a bin. He always lets the quaffle in. Weasley will make sure we win. But Harry had seen it at last. The tiny, fluttering gold snitch was hovering feet from the ground at the Slytherin end of the pitch. He dived. In a matter of seconds, Malfoy was streaking out of the sky on Harry's left, a green and silver blur, lying flat on his broom. The snitch skirted the foot of one of the goal hoops and scooted off towards the other side of the stands. Its change of direction suited Malfoy, who was nearer. Harry pulled his firebolt around. He and Malfoy were now neck and neck. Feet from the ground, Harry lifted his right hand from his broom, stretching towards the snitch. To his right, Malfoy's arm, extended too, was reaching, groping. It was over in 2 breathless, desperate, windswept seconds. Harry's fingers closed around the tiny, struggling ball. Malfoy's fingernails grabbed and scrabbled the back of Harry's hand hopelessly. Harry pulled his broom upwards, holding the struggling ball in his hand, and the Gryffindor spectators screamed their approval. They were saved. It did not matter that Ron had let in those goals. Nobody would remember, as long as Gryffindor had won. Wham! A bludger hit Harry squarely in the small of the back, and he flew forwards off his broom. Luckily, he was only 5 or 6 feet above the ground, having dived so low to catch the snitch, but he was winded all the same as he landed flat on his back on the frozen pitch. He heard Madame Hooch's shrill whistle, an uproar in the stands compounded of catcalls, angry yells and jeering, a thud, and then Angelina's frantic voice. "Are you all right?" "Course I am," said Harry grimly, taking her hand and allowing her to pull him to his feet. Madame Hooch was zooming towards one of the Slytherin players above him, though he could not see who it was from this angle. "It was the thug, Crabbe," said Angelina angrily. "He whacked the bludger at you the moment he saw you got the snitch. But we won, Harry. We won!" Harry heard a snort from behind him and turned around, still holding the snitch tightly in his hand. Draco Malfoy had landed close by, white-faced with fury. He was still managing to sneer. "Saved Weasley's neck, haven't you?" he said to Harry. "I've never seen a worse keeper, but then he was born in a bin. Did you like my lyrics, Potter?" Harry didn't answer. He turned away to meet the rest of the team, who were now landing one by one, yelling and punching the air in triumph, all except Ron, who had dismounted from his broom over by the goalposts and seemed to be making his way slowly back to the changing rooms alone. "We wanted to write another couple of verses," Malfoy called, as Katie and Alicia hugged Harry. "But we couldn't find rhymes for fat and ugly. We wanted to sing about his mother, see?" "Talk about sour grapes," said Angelina, casting Malfoy a disgusted look. "We couldn't fit in useless loser either. For his father, you know." Fred and George had realised what Malfoy was talking about. Halfway through shaking Harry's hand, they stiffened, looking round at Malfoy. "Leave it," said Angelina at once, taking Fred by the arm. "Leave it, Fred. Let him yell. He's just sorry he lost. The jumped-up little—" "But you like the Weasleys, don't you, Potter?" said Malfoy, sneering. "Spend holidays there and everything, don't you? Can't see how you stand the stink, but I suppose when you've been dragged in up by muggles, even the Weasleys' hovel smells okay." Harry grabbed hold of George. Meanwhile, it was taking the combined efforts of Angelina, Alicia and Katie to stop Fred leaping on Malfoy, who was laughing openly. Harry looked around for Madame Hooch, but she was still berating Crabbe for his illegal bludger attack. "Or perhaps," said Malfoy, leering as he backed away, "you can remember what your mother's house stank like, Potter, and Weasley's pigsty reminds you of it." Harry was not aware of releasing George. All he knew was that a second later both of them were sprinting towards Malfoy. He had completely forgotten that all the teachers were watching. All he wanted to do was cause Malfoy as much pain as possible. With no time to draw out his wand, he merely drew back, the fist clutching the snitch, and sank it as hard as he could into Malfoy's stomach. "Harry! Harry! George, no!" He could hear girls' voices screaming, Malfoy yelling,
George swearing, a whistle blowing, and the bellowing of the crowd around him. But he did not care. Not until somebody in the vicinity yelled, "Impedimenta!" and he was knocked over backwards by the force of the spell, did he abandon the attempt to punch every inch of Malfoy he could reach. "What do you think you're doing?" screamed Madame Hooch, as Harry leapt to his feet. It seemed to have been her who had hit him with the impediment jinx. She was holding her whistle in one hand and a wand in the other. Her broom lay abandoned several feet away. Malfoy was curled up on the ground, whimpering and moaning, his nose bloody. George was sporting a swollen lip. Fred was still being forcibly restrained by the three chasers, and Crabbe was cackling in the background. "I've never seen behaviour like it. Back up to the castle, both of you, and straight to your head of house's office. Go, now!" Harry and George marched off the pitch, both panting, neither saying a word to the other. The howling and jeering of the crowd grew fainter and fainter until they reached the entrance hall, where they could hear nothing except the sound of their own footsteps. Harry became aware that something was still struggling in his right hand, the knuckles of which had been bruised against Malfoy's jaw. Looking down, he saw the snitch's silver wings protruding from between his fingers, struggling for release. They had barely reached the door of Professor McGonagall's office when she came marching along the corridor behind them. She was wearing a Gryffindor scarf, but tore it from her throat and shaking hands as she strode towards them, looking livid. "In!" she said furiously, pointing to the door. Harry and George entered. She strode around behind her desk and faced them, quivering with rage as she threw the Gryffindor scarf aside on the floor. "Well," she said, "I have never seen such a disgraceful exhibition. 2 on 1. Explain yourselves." "Malfoy provoked us," said Harry stiffly. "Provoked you?" shouted Professor McGonagall, slamming her fist on her desk so that her tartan tin slid sideways off it and burst open, littering the floor with ginger newts. "He'd just lost, hadn't he? Of course he wanted to provoke you, but what on earth he can have said that justified what you two—" "He insulted my parents," snarled George, "and Harry's mother. But instead of leaving it to Madame Hooch to sort out, you two decided to give an exhibition of muggle duelling, did you?" bellowed Professor McGonagall. "Have you any idea what you've—" Ahem! Harry and George both spun around. Dolores Umbridge was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a green tweed cloak that greatly enhanced her resemblance to a giant toad, and was smiling in the horrible, sickly, ominous way that Harry had come to associate with imminent misery. "May I help, Professor McGonagall?" asked Professor Umbridge in her most poisonously sweet voice. Blood rushed into Professor McGonagall's face. "Help?" she repeated in a constricted voice. "What do you mean, help?" Professor Umbridge moved forwards into the office, still smiling her sickly smile. "Why, I thought you might be grateful for a little extra authority." Harry would not have been surprised to see sparks fly from Professor McGonagall's nostrils. "You thought wrong," she said, turning her back on Umbridge. "Now, you two had better listen closely. I do not care what provocation Malfoy offered you. I do not care if you insulted every family member you possess. Your behaviour was disgusting, and I am giving each of you a week's worth of detentions. Do not look at me like that, Potter. You deserve it. And if either of you ever—" Ahem! Professor McGonagall closed her eyes as though praying for patience as she turned her face towards Professor Umbridge again. "Yes, I think they deserve rather more than detentions," said Umbridge, smiling still more broadly. Professor McGonagall's eyes flew open. "But unfortunately," she said, with an attempt at a reciprocal smile that made her look as though she had lockjaw, "it is what I think that counts, as they are in my house, Dolores." "Well, actually, Minerva," simpered Professor Umbridge, "I think you'll find that what I think does count. Now, where is it? Cornelius just sent it. I mean—" She gave a false little laugh as she rummaged in her handbag. "The minister just sent it. Ah, yes." She had pulled out a piece of parchment, which she now unfurled, clearing her throat fussily before starting to read what it said. "Ahem. Educational Decree number 25. "Not another one!" exclaimed Professor McGonagall violently. "Well, yes," said Umbridge, still smiling. "As a matter of fact, Minerva, it was you who made me see what we needed. We needed a further amendment. You remember how you overrode me when I was unwilling to allow the Gryffindor Quidditch team to reform? How you took the case to Dumbledore, who insisted that the team be allowed to play? Well, now I couldn't have that. I contacted the minister at once, and he quite agreed with me that the High Inquisitor has to have the power to stop or strip pupils of privileges, or she, that is to say I, would have less authority than common teachers. And you see now, don't you, Minerva, how right I was in attempting to stop the Gryffindor team reforming. Dreadful tempers. Anyway,
I was reading out our amendment. The High Inquisitor will henceforth have supreme authority over all punishments, sanctions, and removal of privileges pertaining to the students of Hogwarts, and the power to alter such punishments, sanctions, and removals of privileges as may have been ordered by other staff members. Signed, Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic, Order of Merlin, First Class, etc., etc. She rolled up the parchment and put it back into her handbag, still smiling. So, I really think I have to ban these two from playing Quidditch ever again, she said, looking from Harry to George and back again. Harry felt the snitch fluttering madly in his hand. Ban us, he said, and his voice sounded strangely distant. From playing? Ever again? Yes, Mr. Potter, I think a lifelong ban ought to do the nick, said Umbridge, her smile widening still further as she watched him struggle to comprehend what she had said. You and Mr. Weasley here, and I think to be safe, this young man's twin ought to be stopped too. If his teammates had not restrained him, I feel sure he would have attacked young Malfoy as well. I will want their broomsticks confiscated, and of course I shall keep them safely in my office to make sure there is no infringement of my ban. But I am not unreasonable, Professor McGonagall, she continued, turning back to Professor McGonagall, who was now standing as still as though carved from ice, staring at her. The rest of the team can continue playing. I saw no signs of violence from any of them. Well, good afternoon to you. And with a look of the utmost satisfaction, Umbridge left the room, leaving a horrified silence in her wake. Banned, said Angelina in a hollow voice, late that evening in the common room. Banned. No sneaker and no beaters. What on earth are we going to do? It did not feel as though they had won the match at all. Everywhere Harry looked there was disconsolate and angry faces. The team themselves were slumped around the fire, all apart from Ron, who had not been seen since the end of the match. It's just so unfair, said Alicia numbly. I mean, what about Crabbe and that bludger he hit after the whistle had been blown? Has she banned him? No, said Ginny miserably. She said Hermione. She and Hermione were sitting on either side of Harry. He just got lines. I heard Montague laughing about it at dinner. And banning Fred when he didn't even do anything, said Alicia furiously, pummelling her knee with her fist. It's not my fault I didn't, said Fred, with a very ugly look on his face. I would have pounded the little scumbag to a pulp if you three hadn't been holding me back. Harry stared miserably at the dark window. Snow was falling. The snitch he had caught earlier was now zooming around and around the common room. People were watching its progress as though hypnotised, and Crookshanks was leaping from chair to chair trying to catch it. I'm going to bed, said Angelina, getting slowly to her feet. Maybe this will all turn out to have been a bad dream. Maybe I'll wake up tomorrow and find we haven't even played yet. She was soon followed by Alicia and Katie. Fred and George sloped off to bed some time later, glowering at everyone they passed, and Ginny went not long after that. Only Harry and Hermione were left beside the fire. Have you seen Ron? Hermione asked in a low voice. Harry shook his head. I think he's avoiding us, said Hermione. Where do you think he... But at that precise moment there was a creaking sound behind them as the fat lady swung forwards and Ron came clambering through the portrait hole. He was very pale indeed, and there was snow in his hair. When he saw Harry and Hermione, he stopped dead in his tracks. Where have you been? Said Hermione anxiously, springing up. Walking, Ron mumbled. He was still wearing his Quidditch things. You look frozen, said Hermione. Come and sit down. Ron walked to the fireside and sank into the chair furthest from Harry's, not looking at him. The stolen snitch zoomed over their heads. I'm sorry, Ron mumbled, looking at his feet. What for? Said Harry. For thinking I can play Quidditch, said Ron. I'm going to resign first thing tomorrow. If you resign, said Harry testily, there'll only be 3 players left on the team. And when Ron looked puzzled, he said, I've been given a lifetime ban. So Fred and George. What? Ron yelped. Hermione told him the full story. Harry could not bear to tell it again. When she had finished, Ron looked more anguished than ever. This is all my fault. You didn't make me punch Malfoy, said Harry angrily. If I wasn't so terrible at Quidditch, it's got nothing to do with that. It was that song that wound me up. It would have wound anyone up. Hermione got up and walked to the window, away from the argument, watching the snow swirling down against the pane. Look, drop it, will you? Harry burst out. It's bad enough without you blaming yourself for everything. Ron said nothing, but sat gazing miserably at the damp hem of his robes. After a while he said in a dull voice, This is the worst I've ever felt in my life. Join the club, said Harry bitterly. Well, said Hermione in her voice trembling slightly. I can think of one thing that might cheer you both up. Oh, yeah? Said Harry sceptically.
"Yeah," said Hermione, turning away from the pitch-black, snow-flecked window, a broad smile spreading across her face. "Hagrid's back." Chapter 20. Hagrid's Tale. Harry sprinted up to the boys' dormitories to fetch the invisibility cloak and the Marauder's map from his trunk. He was so quick that he and Ron were ready to leave at least 5 minutes before Hermione hurried back down from the girls' dormitories, wearing scarf, gloves, and one of her own knobbly elf hats. "Well, it's cold out there," she said defensively, as Ron clicked his tongue impatiently. They crept through the portrait hole and covered themselves hastily in the cloak. Ron had grown so much, he now needed to crouch to prevent his feet showing. Then, moving slowly and cautiously, they proceeded down the many staircases, pausing at intervals to check on the map for signs of Filch or Mrs. Norris. They were lucky. They saw nobody but nearly headless Nick, who was gliding along absent-mindedly, humming something that sounded horribly like "Weasley is our king." They crept across the entrance hall and out into the silent, snowy grounds. With a great leap of his heart, Harry saw little golden squares of light ahead and smoke coiling up from Hagrid's chimney. He set off at a quick march, the other two jostling and bumping along behind him. They crunched excitedly through the thickening snow until at last they reached the wooden front door. When Harry raised his fist and knocked about 3 times, a dog started barking frantically inside. "Hagrid, it's us," Harry called through the keyhole. "Should have known," said a gruff voice. They beamed at each other under the cloak. They could tell by Hagrid's voice that he was pleased. "Been home 3 seconds. Out the way, Fang. Out the way, you dozy dog." The bolt was drawn back. The door creaked open and Hagrid's head appeared at the gap. Hermione screamed. "Merlin's beard, keep it down," said Hagrid hastily, staring wildly over their heads. "Under that cloak, are you? Well, get in, get in." "I'm sorry," Hermione gasped, as the 3 of them squeezed past Hagrid into the house and pulled the cloak off themselves so he could see them. Oh, Hagrid." "It's nothing," said Hagrid hastily, shutting the door behind them and hurrying to close all the curtains, but Hermione continued to gaze up at him in horror. Hagrid's hair was matted with congealed blood, and his left eye had been reduced to a puffy slit amid a mass of purple and black bruising. There were many cuts on his face and hands, some of them still bleeding, and he was moving gingerly, which made Harry suspect broken ribs. It was obvious that he'd only just got home. A thick, black travelling cloak lay over the back of a chair, and a haversack large enough to carry several small children leaned against the wall inside the door. Hagrid himself, twice the size of a normal man, was now limping over to the fire and placing a copper kettle over it. "What happened to you?" Harry demanded, while Fang danced around them all, trying to lick their faces. "Told you nothing," said Hagrid firmly. "Want a cuppa?" "Come off it," said Ron. "You're in a right state." "I'm telling you, I'm fine," said Hagrid, straightening up and turning to beam at them all, but wincing. "Blimey, it's good to see you 3 again. Had good summers, did you?" "Hagrid, you've been attacked," said Ron. "For the last time, it's nothing," said Hagrid firmly. "Would you say it was nothing if one of us turned up with a pound of mince instead of a face?" Ron demanded. "You ought to go and see Madame Pomfrey, Hagrid," said Hermione anxiously. "Some of those cuts look nasty." "I'm dealing with it, all right?" said Hagrid repressively. He walked across to the enormous wooden table that stood in the middle of his cabin and twitched aside a tea towel that had been lying on it. Underneath was a raw, bloody, green-tinged steak, slightly larger than the average car tyre. "You're not going to eat that, are you, Hagrid?" said Ron, leaning in for a closer look. "It looks poisonous." "It's supposed to look like that. It's dragon meat," Hagrid said, "and I didn't get it to eat it." He picked up the steak and slapped it over the left side of his face. Greenish blood trickled down into his beard as he gave a soft moan of satisfaction. "That's better. Helps with the stinging, you know." "So, are you going to tell us what's happened to you?" Harry asked. "Can't, Harry. Top secret. More than me job's worth to tell you that." "Did the giants beat you up, Hagrid?" asked Hermione quietly. Hagrid's fingers slipped on the dragon steak, and it slid squelchily onto his chest. "Giants?" said Hagrid, catching the steak before it reached his belt and slapping it back over his face. "Who said anything about giants? Who you been talking to? Who's told you who said I've been a—" "We guessed," said Hermione apologetically. "Oh, you did you?" said Hagrid, fixing her sternly with the eye that was not hidden by the steak. "It was kind of obvious," said Ron. Harry nodded. Hagrid glared at them, then snorted, threw the steak back onto the table and strode over to the kettle, which was now whistling. "Never known kids like you 3 for knowing more than you ought to," he muttered, splashing the boiling water into 3 of the bucket-shaped mugs. And I'm not complimenting you neither. Nosy, some 'ud call it interfering. But his beard twitched. So you've been to look for giants, said Harry, grinning as he sat down at the table. Hagrid set tea in front of each of them, sat down, picked up his steak again, and slapped it back over his face. Yeah, all right, he grunted. I have. And you found them, said Hermione in a hushed voice. Well, you're not that difficult to find. They're not that difficult to find, to be honest, said Hagrid. Pretty big, see? Where are they, said Ron. Mountains, said Hagrid unhelpfully. So why don't muggles... They do, said Hagrid darkly. Only their deaths are always put down to mountaineering accidents, aren't they? He adjusted the steak a little so that it covered the worst of the bruising. Come on, Hagrid, tell us what you've been up to, said Ron. Tell us about being attacked by the giants, and Harry can tell you about being attacked by the Dementors. Hagrid choked on his mug and dropped his steak at the same time. A large quantity of spit, tea and dragon blood was sprayed over the table as Hagrid coughed and spluttered and steak slid with a soft splat onto the floor. What do you mean attacked by Dementors? Growled Hagrid. Didn't you know? Hermione asked him wide-eyed. I don't know nothing that's been happening since I left. I was on a secret mission, wasn't I? I didn't want owls following me all over the place. Really, Dementors? You're not serious. Yeah, I am. They turned up in Little Winging and attacked my cousin and me, and then the Ministry of Magic expelled me. What? And I had to go to a hearing and everything, but tell us about the giants first. You were expelled? Tell us about your summer, and I'll tell you about mine. Hagrid glared at him through his open eye. Harry looked right back, an expression of innocent determination on his face. Oh, all right, Hagrid said in a resigned voice. He bent down and tugged the dragon steak out of Fang's mouth. Oh, Hagrid, don't, it's not hygiene, Hermione began, but Hagrid had already slapped the meat back over his swollen eye. He took another fortifying gulp of tea and then said, Well, we set off right after term ended. Madame Maxine went with you then, Hermione interjected. Yeah, that's right, said Hagrid, and a softened expression appeared on the few inches of face that were not obscured by beard or green steak. Yeah, it was just the pair of us, and I'll tell you this, she's not afraid of nothing. Roughing it. Olymp, she's a fine, well-dressed woman, and knowing where we was going, I wondered how she'd feel about clambering over boulders and sleeping in caves and that, but she never complained once. You knew where you were going, Harry asked. You knew where the giants were. Well, Dumbledore knew, and he told us, said Hagrid. Are they hidden, said Ron. Is it a secret, where they are? Not really, said Hagrid, shaking his shaggy head. It's just that most wizards aren't bothered what they are, or where they are, so long as it's good long a way away, but where they are is very difficult to get to, for humans anyway, so we needed Dumbledore's instructions. Took us about a month to get there. A month, said Ron, as though he had never heard of a journey lasting such a ridiculously long time. But why couldn't you just grab a portkey or something? There was an odd expression in Hagrid's unobscured eye as he squinted at Ron. It was almost pitying. We're being watched, Ron, he said gruffly. What do you mean? You don't understand, said Hagrid. The Ministry's keeping an eye on Dumbledore, and anyone they reckon's in league with him. And we know about that, said Harry quickly, being keen to hear the rest of Hagrid's story. We know about the Ministry watching Dumbledore. So you couldn't use magic to get there? Asked Ron, looking dumbstruck. You had to act like muggles all the way. Well, not exactly all the way, said Hagrid cagily. We just had to be careful, because Olympia and me, we stick out a bit. Ron made a stifled noise somewhere between a snort and a sniff, and hastily took a gulp of tea. And we're not hard to follow. We was protruding, pretending we was going on holiday together. So we got into France, and we made like he was heading for where Olympus School is, because we knew we was being tailed by someone from the Ministry. We had to go slow, because I'm not really supposed to use magic, and we know the Ministry be looking for a reason to run at us. But we managed to give the Burke tailing us the slip round about Dijon. Ooh, Dijon, said Hermione excitedly. I've been there on holiday. Did you see? She fell silent at the look on Ron's face. We chanced a bit of magic after that, and it wasn't a bad journey. Ran into a couple of mad trolls on the Polish border, and I had a slight disagreement with a vampire in a pub in Minsk. But apart from that, couldn't been smoother. And then we reached the place, and we started trekking up through the mountains, looking for signs of them. Well, we had to lay off the magic once we got near them, partly because they don't like wizards, and we don't want to put their backs up too soon, as partly
and partly because Dumbledore had warned us you-know-who was bound to be after the giants and all. Said it was odds on he'd sent a messenger off to them already. Told us to be very careful of drawing attention to ourselves as we got nearer in case there were Death Eaters around." Hagrid paused for a long draught of tea. "Go on," said Harry urgently. "Found 'em," said Hagrid boldly. "Went over a ridge one night and there they was, spread over underneath us. Little fires burning below on huge shadows. It was like watching bits of the mountain moving." "How big are they?" asked Ron in a hushed voice. "About 20 feet, said Hagrid casually. "Some of the bigger ones might have been 25. "And how many were there?" asked Harry. "I reckon about 70 or 80, said Hagrid. "Is that all?" said Hermione. "Yup," said Hagrid sadly. 80 left. And there was loads once. Must have been 100 different tribes from all over the world, but they've been dying out for ages. Wizards killed a few, of course, but mostly they killed each other. And now they're dying out faster than ever. They're not made to live bunched up together like that. Dumbledore says it's our fault. It was the wizards who forced them to go and made them live a good long way away from us. And now they had no choice but to stick together for their own protection." "So," said Harry, "you saw them and then what?" "Well, we waited till morning. Didn't want to go sneaking up on them in the dark for our own safety," said Hagrid. "About 3 in the morning, they fell asleep, just where they were sitting. We didn't dare sleep. For one thing, we wanted to make sure none of them were awake. Woke up, came up where we were, and well, another snoring was unbelievable. Caused an avalanche near morning. Anyway, once it was light, we were down to see 'em." "Just like that," said Ron, looking awestruck. "You just walked right into a giant camp." "Well, Dumbledore told us how to do it," said Hagrid. "Gave the Gurg gifts, and show some respect, you know." "Give the what gifts?" asked Harry. "Oh, the Gurg means the chief." "How could you tell which one was the Gurg?" asked Ron. Hagrid grunted in amusement. "No problem," he said. "He was the biggest, the ugliest and the laziest. Sitting there waiting to be brought food by the others. Dead goats and such like. Name a carcass. I put him at 22, 23 feet, and the weight of a couple of bull elephants. Skin like rhino hide and all." "And you just walked up to him," said Hermione breathlessly. "Well, down to him, where he was lying in the valley. They was in this dip between 4 pretty high mountains, see, beside a mountain lake, and Carcass was lying by the lake roaring at the others to feed him and his wife. Olympia and I went down the mountainside." "But didn't they try and kill you when they saw you?" asked Ron incredulously. "It was definitely on some of their minds," said Hagrid, shrugging. "But we did what Dumbledore told us to do, which was to hold our gift up high and keep our eyes on Gurg and ignore the others. So that's what we did, and the rest of them went quiet and watched us pass, and we went right up to Carcass's feet, and we bowed and put our present down in front of him." What did you give a giant?" asked Ron eagerly. "Food? Nah, he can get food all right for himself," said Hagrid. "We took him magic. Giants like magic, just don't like us using it against them. Anyway, that first day we gave him a branch o' Gubrafen fire." Hermione said, "Wow," softly, but Harry and Ron both frowned in puzzlement. "A branch of everlasting fire," said Hermione irritably. "You ought to know that by now. Professor Flitwick's mentioned it at least twice in class." "Well, anyway," said Hagrid quickly, intervening before Ron could answer back. "Dumbledore had bewitched this branch to burn forevermore, which isn't something any wizard could do. So I lies it down in the snow by Carcass's feet and says, 'A gift to the Gurg of the giants from Albus Dumbledore, who sends his respectful greetings.'" "And what did Carcass say?" asked Harry eagerly. "Nothing," said Hagrid. "Didn't speak English." "You're kidding." "Didn't matter," said Hagrid imperturbably. "Dumbledore had warned us that might happen. Carcass knew enough to yell for a couple of giants who knew our lingo as they translated for us." "And did he like the present?" asked Ron. "Oh yeah, it went down a storm once they understood what it was," said Hagrid, turning his dragon stake over to press the cooler side to his swollen eye. "Very pleased. So when I said Albus Dumbledore asked the Gurg to speak with his messenger when he returns tomorrow with another gift." "Why couldn't you speak to them that day?" asked Hermione. "Dumbledore wanted us to make it very slow," said Hagrid. "Let 'em see we kept our promises. We'll come back tomorrow with another present, and then we do come back with another present. Gives a good impression, see? And gives them time to test out their first present and find out it's a good one, and get 'em eager for more. In any case, giants like Carcass overload 'em with information, and they'll kill you just to simplify things. So we bowed, out the way, and went off and found ourselves a nice little cave to spend the night. And the following morning we went back, and this time we found Carcass sitting up waiting for us, looking all eager." And you talked to him? Oh yeah, first we presented him with a nice battle helmet, a goblin made indestructible, you know. And then we sat down and we talked. What did he say? Not much, said Hagrid. Listened mostly, but they were good signs. He'd heard of Dumbledore, heard he'd argued against the killing of the last giants in Britain. Carcass seemed to be quite interested in what Dumbledore had to say. And a few of the others, especially the ones who had some English, they gathered around and listened too. We were hopeful when we left that day, promised to come back next morning with another present. But that night it all went wrong. What do you mean? Said Ron quickly. Well, like I say, they're not meant to live together, giants, said Hagrid sadly. Not in big groups like that. They can help themselves. They can kill each other every few weeks. The men fight each other and the women fight each other and the remnants of the old tribes fight each other, and that's even without squabbles over food and best fires in sleeping pot spots. You'd think, seeing as how the whole race is about finished, they'd lay off each other, but Hagrid sighed deeply. That night a fight broke out. We saw it from the mouth of our cave, looking down on the valley. Went on for hours, wouldn't believe the noise. And when the sun came up, the snow was scarlet and his head was lying at the bottom of the lake. Whose head? Gasped Hermione. Carcass's, said Hagrid heavily. There was a new Gurg, Golgamath. He sighed deeply. Well, we hadn't bargained on a new Gurg 2 days after we'd made friendly contact with the first one. We had a funny feeling Golgamath wouldn't be so keen to listen to us. But we had to try. You went to speak to him? Asked Ron incredulously, after you'd watched him rip off another giant's head. Of course we did, said Hagrid. We hadn't gone all that way to give up after 2 days. We went down with our next present we'd meant to give to Carcass. I knew it was no go before I opened my mouth. He was sitting there wearing Carcass's helmet, leering at us as we got nearer. He was massive, one of the biggest ones there, black hair and matching teeth and a necklace of bones. Human-looking bones, some of them. Well, I gave it a go. Held out a great roll of dragon skin and said, a gift for the Gurg of the Giants. Next thing I knew, I was hanging upside down in the air by my feet. 2 of his mates had grabbed me. Hermione clapped her hands on her mouth. How did you get out of that? Asked Harry. Wouldn't have done if Olympia hadn't been there, said Hagrid. She pulled out her wand and did some of the fastest spell work I've ever seen. Really marvellous. Hit the 2 holding me right in the eyes with conjunctivitis curses, and they dropped me straight away. But we were in trouble then, because we used magic against them, and that's what giants hate about wizards. We had to leg it, and we knew there was no way we were going to be able to march into camp again. Blimey, Hagrid, said Ron quietly. So, how come it's taking you so long to come home, if you were only there for 3 days? Asked Hermione. We didn't leave after 3 days, said Hagrid, looking outraged. Dumbledore was relying on us. But you've just said there was no way you could go back. Not by daylight we couldn't, no. We just had to rethink a bit. Spent a couple of days lying low up in the cave and watching. And what we saw wasn't good. Did he rip off more heads? Asked Hermione, sounding squeamish. No, said Hagrid. Wish he had. What do you mean? I mean, we soon found out he didn't object to all wizards, just us. Death Eaters, said Harry quickly. Yup, said Hagrid darkly. Couple of them were visiting him every day, bringing gifts to the Gurg, and he wasn't dangling them upside down. How do you know they were Death Eaters? Said Ron. Because I recognised one of them. Hagrid growled. McNair. Remember him? Bloke they sent to kill Buckbeak. Maniac he is. Likes killing as much as Golgamath. No wonder they were getting on so well. So McNair's persuaded the giants to join you-know-who, said Hermione desperately. Hold your hippogriffs. I haven't finished my story yet, said Hagrid indignantly, who, considering he had not wanted to tell them anything in the first place, now seemed to be rather enjoying himself. Me and Olympia, well, we talked it over and we agreed just because the Gurg looked like favouring you-know-who didn't mean all of them would. We had to try and persuade some of the others, the ones who hadn't wanted Golgamath as Gurg. How could you tell which ones they were? Asked Ron. Well, they were the ones being beaten to a pulp, weren't they? Said Hagrid patiently. The ones with any sense were keeping out of Golgamath's way, hiding out in caves, round the gully just like we were. So we decided to go poking around the caves by night and see if we couldn't persuade a few of them. You went poking around dark caves looking for giants, said Ron, with awed respect in his voice. Well, it wasn't the giants who worried us most, said Hagrid. We were now concerned about the Death Eaters. Dumbledore had told us before we were not to tangle with them if we could avoid it. Well, the trouble was they knew we was around. Spec Golgamath told them about us. At night, when the giants were sleeping, and we wanted to be creeping into the caves, McNair and the other, they were sneaking around the mountains looking for us. It was hard put to stop Olympa jumping out at them, said Hagrid, the corners of his mouth lifting his wild beard. She was raring to attack 'em. She's something when she's roused, Olympa. Fiery, you know. I expect it's the French in her. Hagrid gazed, misty-eyed, into the fire. Harry allowed him 30 seconds of reminiscence before clearing his throat slightly loudly. So what happened? Did you ever get near any of the other giants? What? Oh, yeah, we did. Yeah, on the third night after Carcass was killed, we crept out of the cave we'd been hiding in and headed back down into the gully, keeping our eyes skinned for the Death Eaters. Got inside a few of the caves. Now go then. In about the 6th one, we found 3 giants hiding. Cave must have been cramped, said Ron. Wasn't room to swing a kneasel, said Hagrid. Didn't they attack when they saw you? asked Hermione. Probably would have done if they'd been in any condition, said Hagrid. But they was badly hurt, all 3 of them. Golgamath's lot had beaten them unconscious. They'd woken up and crawled into the nearest shelter they find. Anyway, one of them had a bit of English, and he translated for the others. And what we had to say didn't seem to go down too badly, so we kept going back, visiting the wounded. I reckon we had about 6 or 7 of them convinced at one point. 6 or 7, said Ron eagerly. Well, that's not bad. Are they going to come over here and start fighting you-know-who with us? But Hermione said, What do you mean at one point, Hagrid? Hagrid looked at her sadly. Golgamath's lot raided the caves. The ones that survived didn't want no more to do with us after that. So there aren't any giants coming, said Ron, looking disappointed. Nope, said Hagrid, heaving a deep sigh as he turned over his steak and applied the cooler side to his face. But we did what we were meant to do. We gave them Dumbledore's message, and some of them heard it, and I expect some, they'll remember it. Just maybe. Them that don't want to stay around Golgamath, they'll move out of the mountains, and there's got to be a chance they'll remember Dumbledore's friendly to them. Could be they'll come. Snow was filling up the window now. Harry became aware that the knees of the robes of his robes were soaked through. Fang was drooling with his head in Harry's lap. Hagrid, said Hermione quietly after a while. Did you hear anything about your mother while you were there? Hagrid's unobscured eye rested upon her, and Hermione looked rather scared. I'm sorry. I forget it. Dead, Hagrid grunted. Died years ago, they told me. Oh, I'm really sorry, said Hermione in a very small voice. Hagrid shrugged his massive shoulders. No need, he said shortly. Can't remember her much. Wasn't a great mother. They were silent again. Hermione glanced nervously at Harry and Ron, plainly wanting them to speak. But you still haven't explained how you got in this state, Hagrid, Ron said, gesturing towards Hagrid's blood-stained face. Or why you're so late back, said Harry. Sirius says Madame Maxine got back ages ago. Who attacked you? Asked Ron. Haven't been attacked, said Hagrid emphatically. But the rest of his words were drowned in a sudden outbreak of rapping on the door. Hermione gasped, her mug slipped through her fingers and smashed onto the floor. Fang yelped. All 4 of them started at the window beside the doorway. The shadow of somebody small and squat rippled across the thin curtain. It's her, Ron whispered. Get under here, Harry said quickly, seizing the invisibility cloak. He swirled it over himself and Hermione, while Ron tore around the table and dived under the cloak as well. Huddled together, they backed away into a corner. Fang was barking madly at the door. Hagrid looked thoroughly confused. Hagrid, hide our mugs. Hagrid seized Harry and Ron's mugs and shoved them under the cushion in Fang's basket. Fang was now leaping up at the door. Hagrid pushed him out of the way with his foot and pulled it open. Professor Umbridge was standing in the doorway, wearing her green tweed cloak and a matching hat and ear flaps. Lips pursed, she leaned back so as to see Hagrid's face. She barely reached his navel. So, she said slowly and loudly, as though speaking to somebody deaf. You're Hagrid, are you? Without waiting for an answer, she strolled into the room, her bulging eyes rolling in every direction. Get away, she snapped, waving her handbag at Fang, who had bounded up to her and was attempting to lick her face. Don't want to be rude, said Hagrid, staring at her, but who the ruddy hell are you? My name is Dolores Umbridge. Her eyes were sweeping the cabin. Twice they stared directly into the corner where Harry stood, sandwiched between Ron and Hermione. Dolores Umbridge,
Hagrid said, sounding thoroughly confused. I thought you were one of them ministry. Don't you work with Fudge?
I was senior under-secretary to the minister, yes, said Umbridge, now pacing around the cabin, taking in every tiny detail within, from the haversack against the wall to the abandoned travelling cloak. I am now the Defence Against the Dark Arts teacher.
That's brave of you, said Hagrid. There's not many that would take that job any more.
And Hogwarts High Inquisitor, said Umbridge, giving no sign that she had heard him.
What's that? Said Hagrid, frowning.
Precisely what I was going to ask, said Umbridge, pointing at the broken shards of china on the floor that had been Hermione's mug.
Oh, said Hagrid, with a most unhelpful glance towards the corner where Harry, Ron and Hermione stood hidden. Oh, that was Fang. He broke a mug, so I had to use this one instead.
Hagrid pointed to the mug from which he had been drinking, one hand still clamped over the dragon stake pressed to his eye. Umbridge stood facing him now, taking in every detail of his appearance instead of the cabins. I heard voices, she said quietly.
I was talking to Fang, said Hagrid stoutly.
And was he talking back to you?
Well, in a manner of speaking, said Hagrid, looking uncomfortable, I sometimes say Fang's near enough human.
There are 3 seats, or 3 sets of footprints in the snow, leading from the castle doors to your cabin, said Umbridge sleekily. Hermione gasped. Harry clapped a hand over her mouth. Luckily, Fang was sniffing loudly around the hem of Professor Umbridge's robes, and she did not appear to have heard.
Well, I only just got back, said Hagrid, waving an enormous hand on the haversack. Maybe someone came to call earlier and I missed them.
There are no footsteps leading away from your cabin door.
Well, I don't know what they'd be, said Hagrid, tugging nervously at his beard, and again glancing towards the corner where Harry, Ron and Hermione stood, as though asking for help.
Umbridge wheeled around and strode the length of the cabin, looking around carefully. She bent and peered under the bed. She opened Hagrid's cupboards. She passed within 2 inches of where Harry, Ron and Hermione stood, pressed against the wall. Harry actually pulled in his stomach as she walked by. After looking carefully inside the enormous cauldron Hagrid used for cooking, she wheeled around again and said, What has happened to you? How did you sustain these injuries? Hagrid hastily removed the dragon stake from his face, which in Harry's opinion was a mistake, because the black and purple bruising all around his eye was now clearly visible, not to mention the large amount of fresh and congealed blood on his face.
Oh, I had a bit of an accident, he said lamely.
What sort of accident?
I tripped.
You tripped?
She repeated coolly. Yeah, that's right, over a friend's broomstick. I don't fly myself. Well, look at the size of me. I don't reckon there's a broomstick that'll hold me. Friend of mine breeds Abraxan horses. I don't know if you've ever seen 'em. Big beasts, winged, you know. I've had a bit of a ride on one of them, and it was a...
Where have you been? Asked Umbridge, cutting coolly through Hagrid's babbling.
Where have I
been? Yes, she said. Term started 2 months ago. Another teacher has had to cover for your classes. None of your colleagues has been able to give me any information on your whereabouts. You left no address. Where have you been? There was a pause in which Hagrid stared at her with his newly uncovered eye. Harry could almost hear his brain working furiously.
I've been away for me health, he said.
For your health, said Professor Umbridge. Her eyes travelled over Hagrid's discoloured and swollen face. Dragon blood dripped gently and silently onto his waistcoat. I see.
Yes, said Hagrid, but a bit of fresh air, you know.
Yes, as gamekeeper, fresh air must be so difficult to come by, said Umbridge sweetly. The small patch of Hagrid's face that was not black and purple flushed.
Well, change your scene, you know.
Mountain scenery, said Umbridge swiftly. She knows, Harry thought desperately.
Mountains?
Hagrid repeated, clearly thinking fast.
Nope, south of France for me, bit of the sun and sea.
Really, said Umbridge, you don't have much of a tan.
Yeah, well, sensitive skin, said Hagrid, attempting an ingratiating smile.
Harry noticed that 2 of his teeth had been knocked out. Umbridge looked at him coldly. His smile faltered. Then she hoisted her handbag a little higher into the crook of her arm and said, I shall, of course, be informing the minister of your late return.
Right, said Hagrid, nodding.
You ought to know, too, that as High Inquisitor it is my unfortunate but necessary duty to inspect my fellow teachers, so I dare say we shall meet again soon enough. She turned sharply and marched back to the door.
You're inspecting us?
Hagrid echoed blankly, looking after her. Oh, yes, said Umbridge softly, looking back at him with her hand on the door handle. The ministry is determined to weed out unsatisfactory teachers. Hagrid, good night." She left, closing the door behind her with a snap. Harry made to pull off the invisibility cloak, but Hermione seized his wrist. "Not yet," she breathed in his ear. "She might not be gone yet." Hagrid seemed to be thinking the same way. He slumped across the room and pulled back the curtain an inch or so. "She's going back to the castle," he said in a low voice. "Blimey, inspecting people, is she?" "Yeah," said Harry, pulling off the cloak. "Trelawney's on probation already." What sort of thing are you planning to do with us in class, Hagrid?" asked Hermione. "Oh, don't you worry about that. I've got a great load of lessons planned," said Hagrid enthusiastically, scooping up his dragon steak from the table and slapping it over his eye again. "I've been keeping a couple of creatures saved for your owl here. You wait, you've something really special." Special in what way?" asked Hermione tentatively. "I'm not saying," said Hagrid happily. "I don't want to spoil the surprise." "Look, Hagrid," said Hermione urgently, dropping all pretense. "Professor Umbridge won't be at all happy if you bring anything into class that's too dangerous." "Dangerous?" said Hagrid, looking genially bemused. "Don't be silly. I wouldn't give you anything dangerous. I mean, all right, they can look after themselves." "Hagrid, you've got to pass Umbridge's inspection, and to do that it would really be better if she saw you teaching us how to look after Porlocks, how to tell the difference between gnarls and hedgehogs, stuff like that," said Hermione earnestly. "But that's not very interesting, Hermione," said Hagrid. "That stuff I've got much more impressive. I've been bringing them on for years. I reckon I've got the only domestic herd in Britain." "Hagrid, please," said Hermione, a note of real desperation in her voice. "Umbridge is looking for any excuse to get rid of teachers she thinks are too close to Dumbledore. Please, Hagrid, teach us something dull that's bound to come up in our owl." But Hagrid merely yawned wildly and cast a one-eyed look of longing towards the vast bed in the corner. "Listen, it's been a long day and it's late," he said, patting Hermione gently on the shoulder so that her knees gave way and hit the floor with a thud. "Oh, sorry." He pulled her back up by the neck of her robes. "Look, don't you go worrying about me. I promise I've got really good stuff planned for your lessons now I'm back. Now you lot better get back up to the castle, and don't forget to wipe your footprints out behind you." "I dunno if you got through to him," said Ron a short while later, when, having checked that the coast was clear, they walked back up to the castle through the thickening snow, leaving no trace behind them due to the obliteration charm Hermione was performing as they went. "Then I'll go back again tomorrow," said Hermione determinedly. "I'll plan his lessons for him if I have to. I don't care if she throws out Trelawney, but she's not getting rid of Hagrid."
Gnomes gerçek. Evet doğru. Aa. Aa. Sen bir bozdun. Ya bir sus. Ya ben kendi takipçilerime sus diyorum, böyle ayıp oluyor gibi oluyor da. Bizim anlaşma şekil bu abi. Yapacak bir şey yok. Bu arada tekrar söylüyorum. Discord'umuzdan, sunucu kanalından IP sürüm alabilirsiniz arkadaşlar. Ya beklerim. Beklerim. Apex bozdu, çok ayıplı sözcükler. Susun lan. Adamlara bak. Zakir hoş geldin, selam. Ya bu şey çizimli olan şey mi? Ya ben onu gördüm bu arada da, şu an bir tane logo yapılıyor. Of, spoiler oldu. O yüzden onu kullanamam diyeyim. Ama elde sağlık. Dediğim gibi başka bir planım olduğu için öyle bir şey düşünmüyorum yani, öyle diyeyim. Hem abi kanka falan diyoruz birbirimize, hem de kavga ediyoruz. Oğlum standart Apernix kitle konuşma şekil bu. Bizde böyle. Takipçilerine sus dedi. Unfollow. Of, keşke şey açsaydım yanda Spotify'ı, neyse. Kordi var mı? Ne olmuş lan, bir demiri olan var mı? Vay anasını be. Umut Discord'umuza gelmiş, hoş geldin. Abi küfür ediyorlar. Ben ne zamanında ban yerim. Şimdi kim küfür ediyor? Nerede ediyor? Bilmiyorum. Ve nasıl yani? O zaman talep aç, destek talebi, moderatörleri etiketle ve banlansın. Çok basit bence Umut'cum. Az önce takım var dediniz. Takımı söyleyin. Banlayalım, uyaralım. Şöyle bir şey görmüyorum ben. Ben yaşamıyorum o an. bana söylüyorsunuz ama bir şey olmuyor yani. Bir şey değiştirmek için öncelikle arkadaşlar bir şey yapmanız lazım. Abi single'ın ne zaman çıkıyor? Single'ı yapacağım arkadaşlar. Mikrofon aldım biliyorsunuz, alım mikrofon. Her yayıncı, YouTuber standart bulunan. Sonra auto tune'u ayarlamaya çalışıyorum. Sesimi ne kadar bozuk yaparsam ve klibi o kadar kötü yaparsam alın ne oğlum? Kısos ne diyorsun? Kısosum ve yemin ediyorum mental sıfır bugün. Adam A diyorsun gülüyor falan. Quadcast standart YouTuber item olmayan YouTuber olamıyor. Evet. Bu arada cidden ya. Böyle dedim bu mikrofonu alayım. Aldıktan sonra dedim artık YouTuber'ım. Sonra abone sayısının arttı. Etkisi var falan değil mi? Bu arada cidden lan chat. Denk geliş bu kadar mı olabilir? Bu arada kameramdaki delay şu an beni delirtiyor. Şu an kameramdaki delay beni delirtiyor. Yapamıyorum, 24 saat sonra yapacağım Apernix'i. İyi sen bilirsin, olur. Reklam gibi olacak Nimo'da. Mert cidden Roxy'yüz küfür etmişti, yıldız koyarak küfür ettim. Twitch moderatörler varsa bakıversin abi. Ve küfür etmiş olma ihtimali ne kadardır? Yıldızlamıştır belki sadece. Zaten küfür etse yıldız çıkmaz ki abi. Link atmıştır belki, bilmiyorum. Yıldız yazmış ya. Nordex burada. Küfür etseydi banlardı zaten aga. Oha, Hypex, Jessum hepsi sövüyor chatte. Arkadaşlar durun. Ya sakin lan. O kadar kasmayın. Bir dahakine ben de geleceğim. Tamamdır, gelmeyi isteyen arkadaşlarım zaten Discord'dan girdiler, söyleyeyim. Banlayın bizi. Apernix kamerasına sinirleniyor. Ya bu kamerayı da neyse, paramın olmadığını fark ettim. Tamam. Benim mikrofonum kulaklığımın Rampage Stromi mük kulaklık. Doğrudur. Ben Rampage'den iyice soğudum bu arada. Ya güzel marka. Ya ama 2 kere kulaklık aldım. Aldığım 2 kulaklıkta birkaç ay sonra bozulmaya başladı ve ben normal çok düzgün kullanan bir insanım. Eşyalarımı böyle atıp fırlatmam, ne bileyim, çok titizlikle kullanan bir insanım. Abi hiçbir şey yapmadan bozulan bir kulaklıktan ben medet umamam. Çok kaliteli miydi fiyat olarak? Hayır. Ama markaya olan güvenim sarsıldı benim. Ha tabi Rampage bana sponsorluk için o ayrı. Abi takım var. İsim söylersen bakarız. Sultan hoş geldin. Selam. Sen beni duyuyor musun? Duyamıyorum. Yazdıklarını okuyabiliyorum. Arkadaşlar bu arada böyle modun falan filan yapmayın. Nordex gibi banlanırsınız. Nordex gibi banlanamazsınız. Nordex moderatör değil mi? Panik. Oha, lav koyuyor bu adam. Elgato'ya sponsorluk öner. Tabi Elgato kollarını açmış beni bekliyor. Bir tane kamerası var Elgato'nun. Abi muazzam bir şey ya. Ahmet hoş geldin bu arada, selam. Nordex tutuyu banlayamıyor, hayır. Abi takımlar. Bak hala da isim söylemiyor. Abi takımlar diyorsun ve hiçbir işe yaramıyor ve boş oluyor. Spam'a giriyor, yapma şunu. Hah tamam, isim söyledin. Teşekkür ederim. Umut'cum. Siz neredesiniz abi? Takımsanız dediğim gibi kicklerim abi. Ya ayrılın ya kapışın şu an ya da kickleyeceğim ikinizi de. İkinizi de kill çekeceğim ya da. 10 9 8 7 6 5 4 3 2 1 Bay bay. J.K. Abi ben şey diyorum yani, zaten yayını izliyorsunuz bir de hani. Ula 10 saniye delay da yok, 3 saniye delay var ve o kadar da değil yani. Chat'e yayına like atmayı, kanala abone olmayı, evet hepsini yapmayı unutmayın arkadaşlar. Zaten yani nasıl destek olacağınızı iyi biliyorsunuz yani. Kalkanım yok. Bu adam beni keser. Bu adam beni keserse çok rahat keser yani. Oğlum kalkanım yok, zırhım yok. Adamlara gittim Spectator'da. Bu adam gelişti. My bad. Küfür etmeyin, küfür edenin ben kulağını çekeyim. Olur. Olur. Rec room indiriyorum 12. Of, pencere açmaya gidiyorum abi, çok sıcak ya. İzmir abi, İzmir böyle bir yer. Chat. O kar yağıyor lan. İzmir kar çiseliyor gibi düşün. İzmir'deyim ve kar yağıyor abi. Of, yemin ediyorum. Ay, yemin ediyorum inanılmaz. Kar değil pamuktur o. Olabilir. Olabilir. Ayaz hoş geldin, selam. Sabah bir çıktım abi, öğlen pardon, dışarıya. Kar böyle yavaş yavaş yağıyor. Ya tutmayacak tabii ki de ama İzmir'de böyle bir şeyin olmuş olma ihtimali muazzam. Vay anasını dedim. Space kalmış, PRB İsa kalmış, Quadric kalmış. Ayaz'cığım Discord'umuzdan alıyorsun IP'yi, sunucu kanalından. O kadar. Herkes öyle gelebilir. Sonraki ele kalabalıklaşalım. Yakında 7000 olacağız. Şu an kaçız? Bakalım. Bayağıdır bakmıyorum, evet. Bu arada ben bir şey unuttum. Onu da yapayım bak, şimdi aklıma geldi. Önce YouTube. Önce YouTube'a bakalım. Ondan sonra iyi falan öyle diyeyim. Sonunda biri bana çalıntı içerik muhabbeti yapmamış. Abi özgün içerikte çalıntı içerikte özgün muhabbeti yiyorum, çok garip. YouTube kitle gerçekten çok garip ya. Şimdi ben hemen şeyi ayarlayayım. Yayın yöneticisinden. Trust'e hoş geldin, selam. Bu arada iyiyim. Soranlara çok teşekkür ederim. Sizler nasılsınız? Ben birine VIP vermeyi unutmuştum, verdim abi. Anlaşıldı, tamam. Tamamdır. 5 gün sonra 12. ayımı yenileceğim. Vay be, bir sene olacak. Sayron hoş geldin, selam. Ayaz bu arada teşekkür ederim. İzmir'in karları da güzel olur. Evet, İzmir'in karlar süper. Discord'un ismi ne? Ünlem Discord yazıp gelebilirsin. Her türden video gelir. Selam. Hoş geldin. Ünlem Discord linkimize erişebileceğiniz adresi veriyor. Reddit reklamı yapıştır. Reddit'te content var. Ben izledim bu arada o videoyu, biliyor musun? Muazzam ötesi bir video abi. Nerede? Reddit'te. Abi özelden atar mısın? Discord linkini falan diyorsan, ya sunucu linkini diyorsan atamam. Discord'dan alınıyor çünkü. Aç bakayım, yayın sonu. Biri Discord linkini atabilir mi Nimo chat'e lütfen efendim. Umut Discord'umuza katılmış. Trust.exe Discord'umuza katılmış. Umut hesabını doğrulamış ve Efecan'la oyunu kazanmış. Eyvallah. Başlayacağız ama birazcık bekleyelim bence. Gelecekler var sanki. Mesela Ayaz Discord linkini açıp ondan sonra Discord'umuza geliyorsun. Anlatıyorum hemen bu arada. Küçük sunucu kanalı buradadır. Sunucu kanalından da IP alıp gelebilirsiniz. Bu kadar. Başka hiçbir şey yok. Balkan'da dün gece fırtına vardı. Umarım felaket olmaz bu arada. L.A. Lanchester hoş geldin, selam Discord'umuza. Vega hoş geldin, merhaba Miniküp hoş geldin, selam. Konuşuyorum, herkese selam diyorum sadece. Sadece sırf bu yayın 150 kişiye selam demişimdir. Yayına girip çıkan 50 kişi vardır belki. Uf, ayıp ya. Of, benim fav şarkı geldi. İzmir'in çıtırı Mert. Yok lan. Bu arada adam gelir bekleyelim dedim. 2 kişi çıktı. Not stonks. Ayıp chat. Apernik skinim nasıl? İyi. Güzel. Kim yaptı lan bunu? İyiymiş. Zakir hoş geldin, selam. Mert bir anda İzmir sokak lezzeti çekiyormuş. Of, hayalim. DC'de link atıyorum. Nimo'ya bak geliyor mu? Bug'a giriyor bazen. DC'de link atarsan siler bu arada. Çünkü izin